When we look at ancient history, we assume most questions have been answered. Museums display artifacts with neat labels. Textbooks organize civilizations into timelines. Archaeologists date objects, classify pottery, reconstruct temples. It all feels settled, as if the past has been filed away properly, categorized and explained. But that's an illusion. The truth is, for every artifact that makes sense, there's another that doesn't. For every technique we understand, there's one that baffles modern engineers. For every ancient text we've deciphered, there are objects so mysterious we can't even agree on what they were for. The physical evidence sits in museums and laboratories where we can touch it, measure it, analyze its chemical composition, and carbon date its age. What we can't do is explain it. Science can tell us a bronze dodecahedron is from the 3rd century AD. It cannot tell us why anyone made it. Analysis can confirm a crystal skull was carved with rotary tools. It cannot confirm when, or by whom, or for what purpose. We can measure the acoustic resonance of a 5,000-year-old chamber. We cannot know why ancient builders cared about that specific frequency. This is the gap where mystery lives, not in the absence of evidence, but in the presence of evidence we can't interpret. 20 discoveries, each with a physical form, each studied by experts, each still unexplained. Some challenge what we think we know about ancient technology. Others suggest knowledge that seems impossibly advanced. A few are simply objects whose purpose has been completely forgotten. This won't be a neat lecture or a list of solved puzzles. Think of it instead as a journey through what we found but cannot fully understand. Some mysteries are small, strange artifacts that fit in your hand. Others are massive structures that required armies of workers. All of them share one thing. After decades or even centuries of study, they still resist complete explanation. So wherever you are right now, sit back, relax, and feel free to let this play in the background. The visuals are here for context if you want them, but they're not necessary. You can just listen, follow along, and let the mysteries unfold. And to begin, we start not with a massive monument or a famous artifact, but with a crystal skull that shouldn't exist, clear quartz carved with impossible precision, its origins debated, its purpose unknown. Let's jump in. In 1924, British explorer Frederick Mitchell Hedges announced that his daughter Anna had discovered a crystal skull in the ruins of Lubantun, a Maya city in what is now Belize. The skull was carved from a single block of clear quartz, anatomically detailed down to a separate movable jaw, and polished to such a mirror finish that light passing through it created strange optical effects. Mitchell Hedges claimed it was ancient, possibly thousands of years old, and hinted it possessed mysterious properties. Newspapers ran sensational stories, the skull toured exhibitions. For decades, it was treated as one of archaeology's most enigmatic artifacts. The Mitchell Hedges skull immediately stood out for several reasons. First, its material. Quartz ranks 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than steel. Carving it into an anatomically accurate skull would require diamond-tipped tools and rotary equipment, or else years of patient grinding with abrasives. Second, the craftsmanship showed no tool marks under magnification, suggesting either extraordinary skill or advanced equipment. Third, the skull was carved against the natural axis of the crystal, meaning the stone should have shattered during the process. That it didn't imply knowledge of crystalline structure and careful technique. But the Mitchell Hedges skull wasn't alone. By the mid-20th century, several crystal skulls had appeared in museum collections. The British Museum acquired one in the 1890s, supposedly from Mexico. The Smithsonian received another as a donation. Others surfaced in private collections across Europe and North America. Some were smaller, cruder. Others showed similar precision to the Mitchell Hedges example. All carried stories of ancient Mesoamerican origins, though documentation was consistently vague. No skull had been found in a controlled archaeological excavation. Everyone had a murky provenance, purchased from dealers or donated by collectors who couldn't or wouldn't specify exactly where they came from. The authenticity question intensified in the late 20th century when museums began applying modern analytical techniques. In 2008, the British Museum and Smithsonian commissioned detailed studies of their skulls using electron microscopy. The results were unambiguous. Both skulls showed surface marks consistent with rotary tools, specifically jeweler's wheels, of a type developed in 19th century Europe. The British Museum skull had been carved with technology that didn't exist in pre-Columbian America. Further investigation revealed that both skulls had likely been manufactured in Germany in the 1800s, part of a cottage industry producing Aztec artifacts for European collectors fascinated by New World antiquities. This didn't necessarily condemn all crystal skulls. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures did carve rock crystal. The British Museum holds genuine pre-Columbian crystal pieces, mostly small figurines and ornaments, all with documented archaeological contexts. Rock crystal was valued in Aztec culture for its clarity and association with water deities. What made the large skulls suspicious wasn't the material or even the skill. It was the complete absence of archaeological context combined with telltale signs of modern manufacture. The Mitchell-Hedges skull faced additional scrutiny. Researchers digging through archives found no mention of Anna's dramatic discovery in contemporary expedition records. Frederick Mitchell-Hedges himself hadn't mentioned owning a crystal skull until the 1940s, 2 decades after the supposed discovery. Evidence suggested he'd purchased it at a Sotheby's auction in London in 1943. The romantic story of finding it in a Maya temple appeared to be fabrication, likely crafted to increase the object's mystique and value. There are intriguing details that complicate the dismissal. Some crystal skulls, including the Mitchell-Hedges example, show remarkable optical properties. When lit from below, light channels through the crystal in ways that create glowing effects in the eye sockets. Whether this was intentional design or fortuitous accident depends on whether the carver understood crystal optics. The separate jaw piece, carved from the same crystal block, required considerable planning and skill to execute without breaking either component. Even if 19th century, the craftsmanship is impressive. The broader question remains about whether any large crystal skull is genuinely ancient. Modern analysis has debunked several, but does that condemn all of them? Some researchers argue that the 19th century skulls might have been inspired by earlier genuine examples, now lost or still uncatalogued in private collections. Others point out that if pre-Columbian Mesoamericans could carve small crystal objects, they could theoretically carve large ones, given enough time and motivation. The Maya had jade working techniques sophisticated enough for delicate carving. Quartz is harder than jade, but not impossibly so. Yet the archaeological silence is damning. Thousands of pre-Columbian sites have been excavated across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Not one has yielded a large crystal skull in controlled context. Codices and colonial-era accounts describe Aztec and Maya art extensively. None mention crystal skulls. The closest references are to small carved stones and masks, nothing approaching the size or detail of the museum examples. What makes the crystal skulls fascinating isn't just their craftsmanship, but the gap between physical object and knowable history. We can hold them, photograph them, analyze them with electron microscopes. We can determine that most were carved with 19th century tools. What we cannot do with certainty is eliminate the possibility that somewhere, perhaps in a private collection or undiscovered tomb, an authentic ancient example exists. The fakes prove that creating such objects was possible. They don't prove that ancient peoples never tried. Without provenance, we cannot separate Victorian forgery from pre-Columbian original. Even the Mitchell-Hedges skull, despite debunking of its discovery story and evidence of modern manufacture, retains defenders who argue the analytical techniques might have missed something, or that the skull could be ancient but modified with modern tools. The debates continue, fueled by the object's undeniable visual impact and the persistence of mystery around their origins. So were the crystal skulls ancient religious artifacts with lost ceremonial purposes, or were they 19th century curios created to feed Victorian appetite for exotic antiquities? The skulls exist, precisely carved and optically striking. Their true age and original purpose remain clouded behind dealers' tales and forgers' ambitions. That uncertainty extends beyond the skulls themselves to a larger question about ancient capabilities. If pre-Columbian peoples could carve jade with copper tools and sand, could they have carved quartz given sufficient motivation? The answer is probably yes, though it would have required extraordinary patience. Whether they actually did so, and if any example survives, we simply don't know. From carved crystal, whose age we cannot determine, we move to written metal, whose authenticity is equally contested. In the Arabian Peninsula, a copper scroll inscribed with puzzling text was found in a cave alongside religious manuscripts. But scholars have never agreed on whether it's genuine record or elaborate fiction. The Dead Sea Scrolls are among the most important manuscript discoveries of the 20th century. Between 1947 and 1956, Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists recovered nearly 1,000 texts from caves near the Dead Sea in what is now the West Bank. Most were written on parchment or papyrus, containing biblical texts, religious commentaries, and community rules. They dated to between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, offering unprecedented insight into Judaism during the Second Temple period. Among these precious documents, one scroll stood out for being completely different. In March 1952, archaeologists exploring Cave 3 at Qumran found 2 corroded sheets of copper, rolled up and oxidized together. Unlike every other Dead Sea Scroll, this one was engraved into metal. When specialists finally cut the brittle copper into strips to read it in 1955 and 1956, they discovered it wasn't a religious text at all. It was a list, 64 locations, each with descriptions of buried treasure. The text reads like an inventory. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps, with the entrance at the east, a distance of 40 cubits, a strong box of silver and its vessels, with a weight of 17 talents. Another entry. In the courtyard of the peristyle, 9 cubits under the southern corner, gold and silver vessels for tithe, sprinkling basins, cups, sacrificial bowls, libation vessels, in all 609. Entry after entry follows this pattern. Location, depth or distance, type of treasure, quantity. The quantities are staggering. Tallied up, the copper scroll describes roughly 60 to 100 tons of gold and silver, plus sacred vessels, scrolls, and priestly garments. If even a fraction of this treasure existed, it would represent a fortune beyond the wealth of most ancient kingdoms. Some entries specifically mention temple vessels and tithes, leading many scholars to connect the inventory with the Second Temple in Jerusalem, destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. According to this theory, priests hiding sacred objects from the Roman invasion created the scroll as a permanent record of where they'd concealed everything. The language of the copper scroll is different from other Dead Sea texts. It's written in a more colloquial form of Hebrew, closer to the Mishnic Hebrew that developed after the biblical period. The style is terse, functional, like an accountant's ledger rather than a literary or religious work. This difference has sparked debate about whether it even came from the same community that produced the other scrolls. Some argue it was deposited in Cave 3 by a different group entirely, perhaps refugees from Jerusalem carrying records of hidden temple treasures. The problem is that no one has found any of it. Since the scroll's translation, numerous expeditions have searched the locations described. Some sites can be tentatively identified from the geographical clues. Others use place names that don't match any known location. Archaeologists have dug at Achor Valley, They've investigated ruins mentioned in the text. Nothing has been recovered. Not a single coin, vessel, or artifact matching the scroll's descriptions has turned up in the places it specifies. This absence has led to competing interpretations. One camp maintains the scroll is a genuine inventory, but the treasures were removed in antiquity, either by the people who hid them or by subsequent looters who possessed their own copies of the locations. Another theory suggests the landmarks have changed over 2 millennia through erosion, construction, and shifting geography, making the directions impossible to follow accurately now. Others are more skeptical. Some scholars argue the Copper Scroll is folklore, a collection of legends about hidden temple treasures that circulated after Jerusalem's destruction. In this reading, it's not meant as a functional map, but as a literary exercise, perhaps recording popular stories about where wealth might have been concealed. The fantastic quantities support this interpretation. 60 tons of gold exceeds reasonable estimates of the Second Temple's total wealth. A more radical theory suggests the scroll is a coded document. The locations and quantities might be symbolic rather than literal, encoding religious or mystical information in the form of a treasure map. Some of the place names include phrases that seem deliberately cryptic or use unusual terminology. Proponents of this view point out that Jewish mystical traditions sometimes encoded sacred knowledge in numerical and geographical puzzles. There are fascinating details that keep the mystery alive. The scroll was engraved on copper, an expensive and difficult medium compared to parchment. This suggests the information was considered important enough to justify the cost and effort of metal engraving, which would last much longer than organic materials. The text was written in a distinctive script, somewhat informal, as if hastily, inscribed by someone not primarily a scribe, and unlike other Dead Sea Scrolls, this one shows no wear from handling or reading, suggesting it was deposited in the cave soon after creation and left undisturbed. The scroll's final entry is particularly intriguing. It mentions another copy, in the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northward and buried at its mouth. A copy of this document, with an explanation and their measurements and an inventory of each thing and other things. If genuine, this suggests the treasure map came with an explanatory key that would clarify the cryptic location descriptions. That second scroll, if it existed, has never been found. Modern scholars remain divided. Establishment archaeology tends toward the folklore interpretation, seeing the scroll as a collection of legends that grew around the trauma of the temple's destruction. But the copper medium, the specific detail, and the matter-of-fact language all suggest someone intended this as a functional record. Why engrave folklore onto expensive copper and hide it in a cave? The linguistic differences from other Dead Sea Scrolls also complicate efforts to understand its origin. If it came from a different community or time period than the religious texts found nearby, it might have been placed in Cave 3 for safekeeping by people fleeing Jerusalem, who chose a location already known as a repository for important documents, or it might have been created by the Qumran community itself as a record of wealth they were stewarding or hiding. The Copper Scroll sits in the Jordan Museum in Amman, its text fully translated, but its meaning still contested. Treasure hunters occasionally mount new expeditions based on fresh interpretations of the geographical clues. None have succeeded. The artifact itself is genuine. The debate is whether its contents describe reality or imagination, whether it's a map to be followed or a story to be remembered. A treasure map with no treasure leads us naturally to another kind of map, one that shows places that shouldn't exist. In 1513, a Turkish admiral created a world map that includes coastlines not officially discovered for centuries. How could a 16th century cartographer have drawn what he should never have seen? In 1929, scholars cataloguing materials at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul discovered a map fragment drawn on gazelle skin. the cartographer's signature identified it as the work of Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and geographer who compiled it in 1513. The map showed the Atlantic Ocean, the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a mysterious landmass extending southward from the New World. What made the discovery remarkable wasn't just the map's age, but its accuracy. Piri Reis created his map only 21 years after Columbus reached the Caribbean. European knowledge of the Americas was still fragmentary in 1513. Explorers had charted parts of the Caribbean and the northern coast of South America, but detailed mapping of the continent's eastern shoreline was decades away. Yet the Piri Reis map shows the Brazilian coast, the bulge of South America, and even the mouth of the Amazon River with surprising precision for the era. Some features align more accurately with modern satellite mapping than other 16th century charts. The admiral himself provided clues about his sources. In marginal notes on the map, Piri Reis explained that he compiled his chart from approximately 20 older maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. He specifically mentioned using a map captured from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus. This established that at least part of his source material came from early age of exploration charts. But the accuracy of certain features, particularly longitudinal measurements, which were notoriously difficult before the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, sparked questions about what other sources he might have accessed. The most controversial aspect is the southern section of the map. Below South America, the chart shows a coastline extending eastward. Some researchers have argued this represents the northern coast of Antarctica. If true, that would be extraordinary. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. More intriguingly, proponents of this theory suggest the coastline shown matches not the ice-covered Antarctica of today, but the land beneath the ice, implying the source map dated from a time when Antarctica was ice-free. That claim requires accepting that the map preserves geographic knowledge from at least 6,000 years ago, before the Antarctic ice sheet formed. It would mean that a seafaring civilization capable of exploring and charting Antarctica existed in the early Holocene, and that fragments of their geographic knowledge survived through successive copying, eventually reaching Ottoman Turkey in the early 16th century. The implications would revolutionize our understanding of ancient civilizations and their capabilities. Mainstream historians and cartographers are skeptical. The conventional interpretation holds that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is simply a distorted representation of the southern tip of South America. Cartographic errors were common in this period. Map makers working from incomplete information and inconsistent sources often produced distortions, duplications, or imaginary features. The apparent coastline could be Tierra del Fuego or Patagonia, stretched and rotated through misunderstanding of the source material or errors in compilation. Studies of the map's projections support this more mundane explanation. The Piri Reis map uses an azimuthal projection centered on Cairo, which would naturally distort southern latitudes. When cartographic historians account for this projection and the limitations of 16th century navigation, the mysterious southern coastline aligns reasonably well with known South American geography. The match to Antarctica's sub-ice topography, when carefully analysed, becomes less convincing. There are intriguing details that fuel both sides of the debate. The map shows the Andes Mountains along the western edge of South America, depicted as a saw-toothed line. It includes islands in the Caribbean that match the actual geography. The level of detail for some regions exceeds what should have been known in 1513 based on recorded voyages. Piri Reis's claim to have used ancient source maps is verifiable to a point. Ottoman archives confirm he had access to a substantial collection of charts and geographic texts captured during naval campaigns. The question of ancient Antarctic charts hinges on whether any civilization before recorded history possessed both the technology to reach Antarctica and the motivation to chart it. The climate argument is plausible. Antarctica was indeed ice-free in geological terms relatively recently, though 6,000 years is actually quite conservative. The coast was likely ice-covered even then. Going back to a genuinely ice-free Antarctica requires reaching 15,000 to 30,000 years ago or earlier, pushing the timeline into periods when no known civilization had ocean-going vessels. Supporters of the ancient source theory point to other puzzling maps. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 also shows Antarctica with internal features. The Boache map from 1754 depicts Antarctica as two landmasses separated by a strait, which is accurate if you remove the ice sheet but was unknown in the 18th century. These maps suggest a tradition of copying from older sources that might preserve genuine, ancient geographic knowledge. Skeptics counter that these similarities reflect shared cartographic errors and speculative geography based on the ancient theory that a large southern continent must exist to balance the northern landmasses. What remains undisputed is that Piri Reis created an impressive chart using whatever sources he could gather. The map shows the admiral's skill in compilation and his access to diverse geographic information. Ottoman Turkey in the early 16th century was a crossroads of cultures, a place where Greek, Arab, Persian, and European knowledge intersected. Piri Reis could have accessed maps and texts from multiple traditions. The mystery isn't whether Piri Reis drew Antarctica. Mainstream scholarship is clear that he didn't. The mystery is what his ancient source maps contained, if they existed, and whether some represent geographic traditions older than we generally acknowledge. Could Phoenician or Carthaginian charts have preserved coastal details from extensive voyaging? Might medieval Arab geographers have compiled knowledge from sources now lost? The marginal notes suggest Piri Reis believed he was working with very old material. Whether that belief was correct remains open. The map hangs in the Library of Congress as a masterpiece of Ottoman cartography. Whether it's evidence of advanced ancient geographic knowledge or simply an impressive compilation using 16th century sources, it demonstrates how much we still don't know about what earlier civilizations discovered and recorded. While Piri Reis's map raises questions about ancient geographic knowledge, our next mystery challenges what we think we know about ancient technological knowledge. In Greece, divers found a corroded mechanism that shouldn't exist, a computer from the time of Cicero. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera spotted what they thought were bodies scattered across the seafloor. When they surfaced and described human forms lying among broken columns, the ship's captain investigated and realized they'd found a shipwreck. The bodies were bronze statues. Over the following months, divers recovered a remarkable haul: marble sculptures, pottery, glassware, jewellery, and coins. Among the artefacts was a corroded lump of bronze encrusted with marine growth, unremarkable enough that it was set aside while more impressive pieces went on display. The lump sat in storage at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Then in 1902, it split open, revealing bronze gears inside. The archaeologist Valerios Stais noticed inscriptions and recognized that this wasn't just corroded metal, but a complex mechanism. Over the following decades, scholars attempted to understand what they were looking at. X-rays in the 1970s revealed the full extent of the gearing system. Advanced CT scanning in 2006 provided detailed three-dimensional views of the internal structure. What emerged from these studies was astonishing. The mechanism contained at least 30 surviving gears, though the original device likely had more. These weren't crude gears, but precisely cut bronze wheels with triangular teeth, arranged in a sophisticated system of intermeshing drives. The gears were mounted in a wooden frame, now decayed, with bronze plates on the front and back faces. Both faces contained rotating dials marked with scales and pointers. The inscriptions, when finally deciphered, turned out to be an instruction manual explaining how to use the device. It was an astronomical calculator. By turning a crank on the side, the user could advance the mechanism forward or backward through time. The front dial displayed the position of the sun and moon through the zodiac, tracking their movement across the sky. Additional pointers showed the phases of the moon and possibly the positions of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The back dials were even more sophisticated. One spiral dial tracked the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period after which the phases of the moon repeat on the same calendar dates. Another spiral, the Saros dial, predicted eclipses years in advance. The precision is what makes the device so remarkable. The gear ratios were carefully calculated to match astronomical periods. The main solar gear, for instance, had to mesh with the lunar gears in such a way that the moon pointer would complete 13.368 revolutions for every 12 revolutions of the sun pointer, accurately representing the lunar month. Achieving this required mathematics and engineering far beyond what historians had attributed to the ancient Greeks for mechanical devices. To put that in perspective, the Antikythera mechanism is more complex than any known device for the next 1,000 years. Medieval Islamic astronomers built astrolabes and other calculating instruments, but nothing approaching this level of geared complexity until the astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe. The mechanism demonstrates that ancient Greeks around the 1st or 2nd century BC possessed gear-cutting technology, understood differential gearing, and could design and build machines of considerable sophistication. The shipwreck itself dates to around 60 BC based on pottery and coins. The mechanism might be older than the ship, an antique even when it sank. Inscriptions mention the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, whose lunar theory from the 2nd century BC matches the device's accuracy. Other evidence points to Archimedes or his school of engineering. Archimedes was famous in antiquity for building elaborate mechanical devices, including a planetarium that Cicero saw and described. Could the Antikythera mechanism be an example of this tradition? There are fascinating details still being uncovered. The mechanism's eclipse predictions aren't random. The Saros cycle of 223 lunar months, roughly 18 years, is an ancient Babylonian discovery about when eclipses repeat. The Greeks incorporated this knowledge into a physical calculating device. Some gears show evidence of having been repaired or modified, suggesting the mechanism was used and maintained over time, not just a showpiece. The inscriptions include month names from Corinth, hinting that the device might have been built there or customized for use in that region. Modern reconstructions have proven the device works. Museums and researchers have built functioning replicas based on the CT scans. When you turn the crank, the pointers move smoothly through their cycles, the dials advance correctly, and eclipse predictions appear where they should. The ancient original, despite 2,000 years of corrosion and loss of most of its components, still contains enough information to reconstruct its operation. Yet this raises the most puzzling question. If ancient Greeks could build this, what else did they build? No other mechanism of comparable complexity has been found. References in ancient texts mention mechanical devices, planetariums, and astronomical models, but nothing that clearly describes geared computers like this. Did such devices exist and simply not survive? Were they rare, known only to a few specialized workshops? Or was the Antikythera mechanism truly unique, an exceptional creation that represented the peak of ancient mechanical engineering? The loss of this technology is equally mysterious. Roman engineering focused on practical applications like aqueducts, roads, and military machines. Geared astronomical calculators, if they existed, didn't become common or standard. By the medieval period, the knowledge of how to build such devices appears to have been lost in the West. When European clockmakers in the 14th century began creating geared astronomical clocks, They were rediscovering principles that the Antikythera mechanism had demonstrated more than a millennium earlier. The mechanism currently sits in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Its corroded gears testament to a level of sophistication that has forced historians to reconsider what ancient civilizations were capable of achieving. It proves that our assumptions about the linear progress of technology can be wrong. Complex devices can be created, used, and then forgotten, their principles lost until later generations rediscover them independently. The bronze gears still hold secrets. Ongoing research continues to decipher faded inscriptions and understand features whose purpose remains unclear. Each advance in imaging technology reveals new details about the construction and use of this device. From Greek gears that calculated the heavens, we turn to Roman concrete that has outlasted anything modern engineers can create. Ancient harbours built with a material stronger than what we use today. The recipe was known. Then it was forgotten. Roman harbours built in the time of Augustus still stand beneath the Mediterranean, their concrete growing stronger with each passing century. Modern concrete piers built in the 1900s are already crumbling. For top 500 years, we couldn't match what Rome achieved routinely. The contrast is stark enough that materials scientists have spent decades trying to understand what the Romans knew that we forgot. The Roman engineering achievement becomes clearer when you consider the environment. Seawater is hostile to modern Portland cement, the standard concrete used worldwide since the 19th century. Salt water chemically attacks the bonds holding the material together, causing deterioration, cracking, and eventual structural failure. A modern concrete pier in the ocean might last 50 to 100 years with maintenance. After that, the damage becomes too extensive, and the structure must be replaced or abandoned. Roman maritime concrete works differently. Analysis of harbour structures at Portus near Rome and Caesarea in Israel shows that the concrete hasn't just survived for 2,000 years, it's actually gotten stronger. The material interacts with seawater in ways that reinforce rather than degrade it. This seems almost paradoxical. How did ancient engineers working with primitive tools and no understanding of chemistry create a building material superior to modern equivalents developed with advanced material science? The key lies in the ingredients. Roman maritime concrete, known as opus caementitium, used volcanic ash from deposits around the Bay of Naples as its primary component. This ash, called pozzolana, after the town of Pozzuoli, has unusual chemical properties. When mixed with lime and seawater, it triggers a reaction that modern concrete doesn't replicate. Instead of simply hardening into a fixed structure, the mixture continues to evolve chemically over time. Research published in 2017 by geologists studying samples from ancient Roman harbours identified the specific mechanism. When seawater penetrates the concrete, which it inevitably does through tiny cracks and pores, it dissolves some of the volcanic materials. This might sound like the beginning of deterioration, but instead it allows new minerals to crystallize within the structure. One mineral in particular, aluminum tobermorite, forms naturally inside the concrete as it reacts with seawater. This rare mineral creates additional binding and actually makes the material more cohesive. The concrete heals itself through a natural chemical process. Modern Portland cement can't do this. It's designed to be chemically stable, which works well on land but becomes a vulnerability in marine environments. Once seawater begins breaking down the bonds in Portland cement, there's no self-repair mechanism. The damage accumulates until the structure fails. Roman concrete, by remaining chemically active, essentially grows stronger, where modern concrete grows weaker. The Romans didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the results. The architect and engineer Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BC, described the use of volcanic ash in concrete and noted its superior performance in water. His text De Architectura includes instructions for making maritime concrete, specifying the proportions and the importance of using volcanic materials from specific regions. But Vitruvius's description, while detailed for its time, wasn't complete enough to preserve the knowledge fully. The evidence of Roman concrete's superiority is visible across the Mediterranean. The harbour at Caesarea, built by Herod the Great around 22 BC, includes breakwaters and docks that remain largely intact beneath the water. The port of Portus, which served as Rome's main harbour, has concrete structures that have survived floods, earthquakes, and 2,000 years of wave action. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 128 AD, has a concrete dome spanning 43 metres with no steel reinforcement. It remained the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world until the 20th century. What makes the loss of this technology particularly puzzling is that concrete itself didn't disappear after Rome's fall. Medieval builders continued using various forms of mortar and cement, but the specific knowledge of how to make maritime concrete using volcanic ash was lost. Either the knowledge was never written down completely, or the texts that contained it didn't survive, or builders simply stopped. Using the technique as large-scale harbour construction declined with Rome's political fragmentation. There are practical reasons the knowledge might have faded. Volcanic ash suitable for Roman concrete comes from specific geological formations, primarily around the Mediterranean. As the Roman Empire contracted and trade networks broke down, access to these materials became difficult. Local builders in Northern Europe or other regions couldn't replicate the technique because they didn't have the right volcanic deposits. Without the ability to practice and refine the method, the detailed knowledge of proportions and procedures was eventually forgotten. Modern rediscovery of the Roman formula has been gradual. Scientists analysing ancient samples have identified the key ingredients: volcanic ash rich in aluminum and silicon, lime from heated limestone, and seawater itself as a component rather than just an environment. Recent research suggests that chunks of quicklime that didn't fully dissolve in the original mixing process may also contribute to the self-healing properties. When cracks form, water reaches these lime clasts, triggering reactions that produce calcium carbonate to fill the gaps. Efforts are now underway to create modern versions of Roman concrete for use in marine environments. If successful, this could revolutionize ocean engineering, from offshore wind farms to seawalls designed to withstand rising seas. The material is also potentially more sustainable than Portland cement, which requires high-temperature kilns that consume enormous amounts of energy and contribute significantly to global carbon emissions. Roman concrete could be produced with lower energy inputs and last far longer, reducing the environmental impact of construction. Yet even with all our analytical tools and understanding of the chemistry, perfectly replicating Roman concrete has proven challenging. The specific volcanic ash composition varies between deposits. The mixing techniques, curing times, and construction methods all affect the final properties. The Romans had centuries to refine their approach through trial and error. Modern engineers are essentially trying to reverse engineer a process developed through generations of practical experience. Roman concrete demonstrates how practical knowledge can be lost even when the physical results remain visible. The Pantheon stands as proof that the technique worked. Vitruvius wrote down instructions, but somewhere in the transition from the ancient world to the medieval period, the full understanding slipped away, leaving later generations unable to match what their ancestors built as a matter of routine. From concrete formulas that were lost, we moved to stone-cutting techniques that seem impossible. In Egypt and Peru, massive blocks were shaped and fitted with precision that baffles modern stonemasons. How did ancient builders achieve tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters? At Sacsayhuaman, in Peru, limestone blocks weighing hundreds of tons fit together so tightly that you cannot slide a razor blade between them. The blocks aren't rectangular, they're polygonal, with dozens of angles each perfectly matched to neighbours. No mortar holds them, only precision. Walk along the walls and you see stones with 12 angles, 18 angles, fitted into gaps like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. The joints are so exact that after more than 500 years and multiple earthquakes, the walls remain stable while Spanish colonial buildings around them have crumbled. This kind of precision fitting appears at multiple sites across the ancient world. At Ollantaytambo, also in Peru, massive andesite blocks form terraces with the same impossibly tight joints. In Egypt, the Osirayun at Abydos contains granite blocks fitted with similar precision. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the Temple of Jupiter sits on a foundation that includes stones weighing over 800 tons, shaped and positioned with careful accuracy. These aren't isolated examples, but patterns that appear across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The technical challenge becomes clear when you consider the materials and supposed tools. Sacsayhuaman's blocks are limestone, which is relatively soft, but nearby Ollantaytambo uses andesite, an extremely hard volcanic rock. Egyptian monuments used both limestone and granite. Granite ranks high on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than copper or bronze tools that ancient Egyptians are known to have possessed. How do you cut and shape granite with copper? The standard answer is that they used harder stones as pounding tools and copper saws with sand as an abrasive. Experimental archaeology has shown this works, but very slowly. The precision is what raises questions. Achieving a tolerance of 0.5 millimeter between multi-ton blocks isn't just about cutting stone, it's about measurement, planning, and execution at a level that challenges even modern stonemasons. Contemporary stoneworkers attempting to replicate these joints with hand tools report that it requires extraordinary patience and skill. Even with modern equipment, power saws and laser measurements, creating polygonal blocks that fit this precisely would be difficult and time-consuming. Modern experiments have tried to replicate the process. Teams working with granite blocks have used copper tools and sand abrasives, successfully cutting the stone, but at a pace that suggests building something like the Great Pyramid with these methods alone would require an impractical amount of time and labour. Other experiments have explored whether lost techniques might have improved efficiency. Could ancient builders have used water and wooden wedges to split stone along natural fracture lines? Could they have employed thermal shock, heating, and cooling rock to make it more workable? Some evidence supports these methods as supplements to grinding and sawing, but they don't fully explain the precision. Fitting. The absence of tool marks in some cases adds another layer of mystery. Certain blocks at megalithic sites show surfaces so smooth that they appear almost polished, with no visible chisel marks or saw cuts. In a few examples, the stone surfaces have slight curves or non-planar faces that somehow still fit together perfectly. Creating this would require either exceptional skill at eyeballing complex geometries or some method of measurement and verification we haven't identified. At Baalbek, the scale defies easy explanation. The foundation stones, called the trilithon, each weigh approximately 800 tons. These aren't roughly shaped boulders, but carefully squared blocks, transported from a quarry a quarter-mile away and lifted into position. Nearby lies an even larger stone, the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing over 1,000 tons, partially cut from the bedrock, but never moved. How did ancient builders plan to move and position something this massive? Modern cranes can lift such weights, but only with specialized equipment. Roman engineers certainly moved enormous objects, but usually through rolling on logs or sliding on sledges, methods that seem impractical for positioning multi-hundred-ton blocks with the precision seen at these sites. Theories about the techniques vary widely. Conventional archaeology maintains that patience, large labour forces, and clever use of ramps, levers, and lubricants can explain most megalithic construction. Stone can be shaped with the tools we know ancient peoples possessed, even if the process would be arduous. The precision fitting might have been achieved through trial fitting, gradually grinding down high spots until blocks seated properly, a process that would take considerable time but was within ancient capabilities. Alternative theories propose lost technologies. Some suggest ancient builders had access to methods for softening stone, making it temporarily malleable, though no chemical or physical process known to science could achieve this with granite or andesite. Others point to the precision and wonder whether some form of advanced measurement tool existed that hasn't survived. Still others speculate about acoustic or vibrational techniques for cutting stone, concepts that remain scientifically unverified. What remains undisputed is the achievement itself. The stones are there, precisely cut and fitted, some of them transported for miles and positioned with care that modern construction projects would struggle to match. Sites like Sacsayhuaman have withstood centuries of earthquakes in seismically active regions, testament to the stability of their construction. The builders clearly understood structural engineering at a sophisticated level, whether or not they had the theoretical knowledge to express their understanding in writing. The lack of written records about construction techniques is perhaps the most frustrating gap. Ancient Egyptian tomb paintings show workers moving statues and raising obelisks, providing glimpses of methods, but they don't explain the fine details of stone cutting and precision fitting. Incan culture had no writing system, so their techniques weren't documented at all. Later Spanish chroniclers described the walls they saw but couldn't explain how they'd been built, as the knowledge had already been lost. Without documentation of methods, we're left interpreting physical evidence and comparing it to what we know is possible with reconstructed ancient tools. The gap between what was achieved and what we can easily explain continues to fuel debate. From cutting stone with lost techniques, we turn to cutting stone in places that seem impossible to reach. High in Bolivia's mountains, a site called Puma Punku is littered with precisely carved blocks that appear machine-made, but there were no machines. At 12,800 feet above sea level, in the Bolivian Altiplano, among the ruins of Tiwanaku, lies a site that shouldn't exist in the form it does. Puma Punku. The name means Door of the Puma in Aymara. Scattered across the ground are red sandstone and andesite blocks carved with perfectly straight edges, precise right angles, and smooth surfaces that look laser-cut. Some weigh several tons. They lie in apparent chaos as if scattered by a catastrophe, yet each displays craftsmanship that seems impossibly refined for a culture that predated the Inca by centuries. The blocks show standardization. This isn't random artistry, but systematic production. Certain shapes repeat across multiple stones. H blocks with identical dimensions, slabs with matching mortise cuts, pieces that clearly once interlocked in ways now disrupted. The repeated measurements suggest these weren't individually custom carved, but produced to standard templates, implying a level of planning and organization we don't usually associate with pre-Columbian highland cultures. The material itself presents challenges. Many blocks are andesite, a volcanic rock ranking between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. This makes it harder than most metals available to ancient South American peoples. Copper and bronze tools would wear down trying to cut andesite. The standard archaeological explanation involves hours of patient grinding with harder stones and sand as an abrasive, a technique proven to work but extraordinarily time-consuming. For blocks showing the precision seen at Puma Punku, this would require not just time but exceptional skill in maintaining consistent angles and flat surfaces through manual abrasion. The precision itself is what catches attention. Some blocks have perfectly flat surfaces spanning several feet with no detectable curvature. Others feature right angles, accurate to within fractions of a degree. The H blocks particularly show mortise holes and channels cut with walls that are precisely parallel and floors that are level. Measuring these features with modern instruments reveals tolerances that contemporary stonemasons would find challenging to achieve even with power tools. The site's altitude complicates any explanation of construction. At nearly 13,000 feet, the thin air makes physical labour significantly more difficult. Workers would tire more quickly, carry less, and work more slowly than at sea level. Yet someone organised enough labourers to quarry, transport, and precisely carve stones weighing up to 130 tonnes, then position them into whatever structure Puma Punku originally formed. The nearest quarry for andesite lies several miles away across terrain that offers no easy transport route. Puma Punku is part of the larger Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished between roughly 500 and 1000 AD. Tiwanaku itself was an impressive city with monumental architecture, sophisticated agriculture based on raised field systems, and trade networks spanning the Andes. The culture clearly possessed engineering capabilities, organizational skills, and the ability to mobilize large labor forces. Puma Punku may have been a ceremonial center, perhaps a temple complex or palace, constructed at the civilization's height. What makes the site particularly mysterious is its current state. The blocks aren't arranged but scattered, some partially buried, others lying at odd angles, still others missing entirely. It looks less like gradual decay and more like violent disruption. Earthquakes are one explanation. The region is seismically active, and a major earthquake could have toppled structures and scattered their components. Some researchers have proposed more dramatic scenarios, catastrophic flooding, or even warfare, though archaeological evidence for such events is limited. The lack of written records from Tiwanaku leaves us guessing about Puma Punku's purpose and construction methods. The Tiwanaku had no writing system. Later Spanish chroniclers recorded some information about Andean cultures, but arrived centuries after Tiwanaku's collapse, finding only ruins and local legends that may or may not preserve accurate historical memory. Some colonial-era accounts describe the site as ancient, even in the 1500s, suggesting its destruction or abandonment occurred long before European contact. Arthur Posnansky, a Bolivian archaeologist working in the early 20th century, proposed controversial dates for Tiwanaku and Puma Punku, arguing they might be 15,000 years old based on astronomical alignments he interpreted in the site's layout. Modern archaeology has thoroughly debunked these extreme dates. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis place Tiwanaku firmly in the first millennium AD. But Posnansky's work, despite being rejected by mainstream scholarship, contributed to popular fascination with the site as potentially more ancient and mysterious than conventional chronology allows. The standardization of the H-blocks has sparked particular interest. These interlocking stone forms, some weighing several tons, show identical cuts and dimensions across multiple examples. This suggests either templates, careful measurement systems, or perhaps trial production to establish standards that later blocks replicated. Any of these possibilities demonstrate sophisticated planning. Ancient Andean cultures are known to have used knotted strings called quipu for recording numerical information, so a system for tracking measurements and standards isn't implausible. Modern visitors to Puma Punku often remark that the blocks look machined, as if cut by saws and drills rather than hand tools. This perception drives alternative theories about lost technologies or outside influence. Mainstream archaeology counters that our underestimation of ancient capabilities doesn't mean those capabilities didn't exist. Given enough time, skilled workers, and appropriate tools, even very hard stone can be shaped precisely. The Tiwanaku had all three, plus strong motivation if Puma Punku held religious or political significance. Yet the question of technique persists. If Tiwanaku stonemasons could achieve this precision, why don't we see similar work at other sites from the same culture? Tiwanaku's other structures are impressive, but don't generally display the same level of refinement visible in Puma Punku's blocks. Was this a special project that commanded the best craftsmen and longest construction time? Or does Puma Punku represent a peak of technical achievement within the culture, perhaps the work of a particularly skilled group of masons whose techniques weren't widely shared or preserved after the civilization's decline? The blocks remain, scattered across the high plateau, each a testament to skill and effort we can measure but not fully explain. They were shaped, they were positioned, they were part of something. Then that something was destroyed or abandoned, leaving only pieces of a puzzle we're still trying to solve. From precision cutting in the mountains, we descend to precision drilling in the desert. At ancient Egyptian sites, perfectly circular holes bored into granite suggest drill speeds and pressures that shouldn't have been possible with the tools we know they had. In the granite sarcophagi of Egyptian tombs and the blocks scattered around temple complexes, archaeologists have found circular holes drilled with such precision that the spiral grooves inside show a drill advancing nearly 1 inch per rotation through solid granite. Modern experiments attempting to replicate this with reconstructed ancient tools can't match that speed. The holes exist. The method that created them remains unclear. Core drilling involves using a hollow tube rotated under pressure to bore cylindrical holes through stone. The technique is ancient and well documented in Egyptian archaeology. What makes certain Egyptian drill holes notable isn't the technique itself, but the execution. When British archaeologist Flinders Petrie examined drill cores and holes at Giza in the 1880s, he noticed something unexpected. The spiral grooves cut into the granite walls descended at a rate suggesting the drill advanced approximately 1 inch for every 6 rotations. That's remarkably fast for granite. Granite is one of the hardest naturally occurring stones, composed primarily of quartz and feldspar. On the Mohs hardness scale, it registers around 6 to 7, harder than copper or bronze, the metals available to ancient Egyptian toolmakers. The conventional explanation for how Egyptians drilled granite involves copper or bronze tubes used with quartz sand as an abrasive. As the tube rotates, the sand particles, harder than the stone being drilled, grind away the granite bit by bit. The method works. Archaeological evidence confirms Egyptians had copper tubes and abundant access to sand. Experimental archaeology has successfully drilled granite this way, but there's a gap between what experiments achieve and what ancient holes show. Modern attempts at drilling granite with copper tubes and sand typically advance much more slowly than the rate Petrie calculated from ancient cores. Contemporary experimental archaeologists report advancement rates of perhaps a few millimeters per hour of sustained drilling. Achieving Petrie's observed rate of nearly 1 inch per 6 rotations would require either extraordinary pressure on the drill, exceptional abrasive material, or both. Christopher Dunn, an engineer who studied the drill holes in the 1990s, calculated the forces that would be necessary to achieve the observed cutting rates. His analysis suggested pressures of several hundred pounds would need to be applied to the drill bits, along with rotation speeds higher than simple manual turning would provide. Dunn proposed that ancient Egyptians might have had more sophisticated drilling equipment than usually credited, perhaps using weighted beams for pressure and some mechanical advantage for rotation speed. Mainstream Egyptology generally holds that while the precise techniques aren't fully understood, they must have been within ancient capabilities because the evidence proves they achieved it. Ancient craftsmen working at a task for extended periods develop extraordinary skill and efficiency. What seems difficult or slow to modern experimenters conducting short-term trials might have been routine for professional stoneworkers who spent careers perfecting their techniques. The spiral grooves could reflect optimal pressure and rotation speed discovered through long practice. The drill holes appear throughout Egyptian archaeological sites spanning different dynasties. They're not anomalous one-offs, but standard features in granite work. This suggests the technique, whatever it was established and reproducible. Temples built centuries apart show similar drilling work, indicating the method was passed down through generations of craftsmen. If it required special equipment or unusual procedures, those would need to have been maintained across considerable time. There are intriguing details in how the holes are positioned and used. Some were clearly functional, drilled to extract cylindrical cores that could be shaped into vessels or other objects. Others seem to have been attempts at splitting large blocks, with multiple holes drilled in lines to create planes of weakness. Still others appear in locations suggesting they were part of structural plans that were later modified or abandoned. The variety of applications shows drilling wasn't rare or reserved for special projects, but a routine part of Egyptian stoneworking. The cores themselves, the cylindrical pieces of granite extracted from the holes, provide additional evidence. Several survive in museums and archaeological collections. Examining them reveals the same spiral grooves visible in the holes, confirming the drill advanced in a helical pattern through the stone. Some cores show variations in groove depth, suggesting changes in pressure or drill speed during the cutting process. These imperfections might reflect the realities of hand-powered work, where maintaining perfectly consistent force over long periods would be challenging. Petrie's observations, made in the 19th century with the measurement tools available to him, have been revisited by later researchers with more sophisticated equipment. Modern microscopy and three-dimensional scanning of drill holes confirm his basic findings about the spiral patterns and advancement rates, though exact measurements vary between different holes. This variation suggests individual drills or drilling teams worked with slightly different techniques or equipment, as would be expected in any craft tradition. The absence of written records describing drilling techniques is frustrating but not surprising. Egyptian texts focused on religious matters, administrative records, and monumental inscriptions praising kings. Technical manuals for craftsmen either weren't written or weren't preserved. Tomb paintings occasionally show workers engaged in various tasks, but they rarely depict stone drilling in enough detail to reveal methods. We're left inferring technique from physical evidence alone. Alternative theories about the drill holes range from the measured to the speculative. Some researchers propose that Egyptians might have discovered ways to temporarily soften stone through chemical treatment, making it easier to drill, though no known substance could achieve this with granite. Others suggest acoustic or vibrational techniques, ideas that lack experimental support but persist in alternative archaeology circles. These explanations typically arise from disbelief that simple tools could achieve the observed results, underestimating what sustained skill and effort can accomplish. What we can say with certainty is that Egyptian craftsmen drilled numerous holes through granite with impressive precision. They did so repeatedly over centuries, and they achieved advancement rates that modern experimenters find difficult to match, using reconstructed ancient tools. Whether this reflects lost refinements in technique, superior raw materials like particularly effective abrasive sand, or simply the accumulated expertise of professional stoneworkers who devoted lifetimes to the craft, the holes themselves stand as evidence of capability that challenges our assumptions about ancient technology. The spiral grooves remain visible in granite blocks and cores across Egypt, precise records of tools moving through stone thousands of years ago. The hands that guided those tools are long gone, and the exact methods they used went unrecorded. What survives is the work itself, tangible and measurable, yet still not fully explained. From drilling precision that challenges our assumptions, we move to construction scale that seems to defy physics itself. The Great Pyramid of Giza isn't just large, it's aligned to true north, with accuracy that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BC for Pharaoh Khufu, is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3.4 arc minutes, or roughly 0.05 degrees. That's extraordinary precision for any era, but particularly for the Bronze Age. European buildings wouldn't achieve comparable alignment accuracy until the invention of the magnetic compass, nearly 4,000 years later. Even with modern surveying equipment, matching this precision requires care and expertise. The ancient Egyptians achieved it without compasses, without telescopes, without any of the instruments we consider essential for accurate positioning. True north is different from magnetic north. A magnetic compass points to the magnetic North Pole, which wanders over time and doesn't align precisely with Earth's rotational axis. True north is the direction along Earth's surface toward the geographic North Pole, the axis around which the planet rotates. Aligning to true north requires astronomical observation, not magnetic instruments. The Egyptians would have needed to observe the stars, track their movements, and calculate directions based on celestial positions. Several methods could theoretically achieve this. One involves observing the star that marks the celestial North Pole. In 2560 BC, the star Thuban in the constellation Draco held that position, though not as precisely as Polaris does today, due to the precession of Earth's axis. By tracking Thuban's position at different times of night and calculating the midpoint of its arc, surveyors could establish true north. Another method involves tracking the rising and setting positions of any star on the horizon and bisecting the angle between them. A third approach uses the shadow of a vertical pole, tracking how it moves throughout the day and identifying the north-south line from the shadow's shortest length at noon. Any of these methods require patient observation, careful measurement, and mathematical calculation. They're all within the capabilities of a culture with skilled astronomers and surveyors. What's impressive isn't that the Egyptians found a method, it's the precision with which they executed it across a structure with sides averaging 230 meters in length. A small error in initial alignment would have been magnified across that distance. That they kept the error to less than 0.05 degrees demonstrates exceptional skill. The base of the pyramid is also remarkably level. Measurements show the base deviates by only about 2.1 centimeters over its 230-meter width. Achieving this on desert bedrock required careful preparation of the foundation, probably by cutting channels and filling them with water to establish a level reference plane, then grinding down any high points. This technique is well within ancient capabilities, but applying it across such a large area without modern surveying equipment required organization and skill. Inside the pyramid, additional alignments add to the mystery. Two narrow shafts extend from the king's chamber at angles precisely aimed at specific stars as they would have appeared around 2500 BC. The southern shaft pointed toward Orion's belt, associated with Osiris in Egyptian religion. The northern shaft aimed at Thuban, the pole star of that era. Similar shafts from the Queen's Chamber have different angles, possibly targeting other celestial features. These aren't ventilation shafts. They're too narrow and don't reach the pyramid's exterior in straightforward paths. They appear to be astronomical alignments with religious significance. The entire structure comprises approximately 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite, with a total mass estimated at 6 million tons. Organising the quarrying, transport, shaping and placement of this volume of stone, while maintaining the astronomical alignments and structural precision, represents a logistical achievement as impressive as the technical one. Workers needed to place blocks at an average rate of 1 every 2 minutes during daylight hours over a 20-year construction period, according to conventional chronology. This assumes a large, well-organized workforce and efficient systems for moving materials. The precision wasn't limited to Khufu's pyramid. Other pyramids at Giza and elsewhere in Egypt show careful astronomical alignment, though not always to the same exacting standard. Some variation exists, with later pyramids sometimes less precisely aligned than the Great Pyramid. This suggests that the techniques were known, but that their application varied depending on resources, time, or perhaps the skill level of particular survey teams. Modern satellite surveys have confirmed and refined Petrie's original measurements of the pyramid's alignment. The precision holds up under scrutiny with contemporary instruments. Some researchers have proposed that the pyramid's alignment was even more precise originally and has shifted slightly due to earthquakes or foundations settling over 4,500 years, though evidence for significant movement is limited. Why such precision mattered to the builders is a question of culture and religion as much as engineering. Egyptian theology connected the pharaoh's afterlife with the stars, particularly Orion and the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon. Aligning the pyramid to celestial north and orienting shafts towards specific stars positioned the structure within a cosmic framework. The precision wasn't arbitrary, but reflected the importance of the alignment to the pyramid's religious function. The mathematical knowledge required to achieve these alignments existed in ancient Egypt. Papyri containing mathematical problems and solutions demonstrate that Egyptian scribes understood geometry, could calculate angles, and worked with fractional measurements. While no text explicitly describes pyramid surveying techniques, the mathematical tools needed to implement the astronomical observation methods were certainly available. What remains uncertain is the exact procedure used. Did surveyors mark the cardinal directions first and then orient the pyramid base? Or did they establish the base square and then check its alignment, making adjustments? Were there trial measurements and corrections during construction? The archaeological record doesn't preserve these details. We see the result, but not the process. The Great Pyramid stands as a testament to Bronze Age astronomical knowledge, mathematical skill, and organizational capacity. The alignment to true north, the level base, and the internal astronomical shafts all demonstrate capabilities that historians once underestimated. The challenge isn't whether ancient Egyptians could achieve such precision. The evidence proves they did. The challenge is reconstructing their methods from indirect evidence and theoretical possibilities. Modern engineers can match the Great Pyramid's precision with satellite GPS, laser levels, and computer-aided design. Ancient Egyptians matched it with star observations, water levels, and geometry. Both approaches work. The ancient methods simply required more time, more skill, and more patience than we typically imagine when thinking about Bronze Age construction. From astronomical alignment at Giza, we travel to astronomical knowledge inscribed in stone at Göbekli Tepe. In Turkey, the world's oldest known temple contains carvings that may record a cosmic catastrophe, one that occurred 11,000 years before anyone was supposed to be recording such things. In southeastern Turkey, at a site called Göbekli Tepe, Stone Age hunter-gatherers carved massive T-shaped pillars and arranged them in circular enclosures. This happened around 9600 BC, more than 6,000 years before writing was invented. 6,000 years before Sumerian cities, 7,000 years before the pyramids. The people who built this had no agriculture, no pottery, no metal tools. They were hunter-gatherers, living in a world that archaeology textbooks used to describe as incapable of monumental architecture. Yet they quarried limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, carved them with intricate animal reliefs, and erected them in patterns that suggest sophisticated planning. The site was discovered in 1994 when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt noticed carved stones protruding from a hillside that local farmers had long known about but considered unremarkable. Excavations revealed what appeared to be the world's oldest known temple complex. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials in the fill confirmed the structures dated to around 9600 BC, making them roughly 11,600 years old. This pushed back the timeline for monumental architecture by millennia and forced reconsideration of what pre-agricultural societies were capable of achieving. Among Göbekli Tepe's many carved pillars, one has attracted particular attention from researchers seeking astronomical interpretations. Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, commonly called the Vulture Stone, displays a crowded scene of animals and symbols. A scorpion appears near the bottom. A vulture-like bird occupies prominent space. A headless human figure is positioned centrally. Above and around these figures are various animal forms: a snake, an ibex, other birds. Circular symbols scattered across the stone could represent celestial bodies. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper arguing that Pillar 43's imagery represents a constellation map recording a comet impact around 10,150 BC. According to their interpretation, the animals carved on the pillar correspond to specific constellations, as they would have appeared in the sky at that time. The circular symbols might represent the sun or comets. The overall scene could be commemorating a catastrophic astronomical event. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid strike around 10,900 BC triggered rapid climate cooling and potentially contributed to the extinction of megafauna and disruption of human societies. The Younger Dryas period is real and well documented in geological and climate records. Between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, Earth experienced a dramatic return to near-glacial conditions after a warming trend. This cold snap lasted about 1,200 years before temperatures rose again. The cause has been debated. Mainstream geology attributes it to disruption of ocean currents, possibly triggered by glacial meltwater. The impact hypothesis, while controversial, has gained some traction based on evidence of widespread fires and a thin layer of impact-related materials dated to the right period. If Pillar 43 does record such an event, it would be extraordinary. It would mean that hunter-gatherers not only witnessed a cosmic catastrophe, but possessed the astronomical knowledge to map constellations, the cultural sophistication to decide such an event should be permanently recorded, and the organizational capacity to undertake monumental stone carving to preserve the memory. All of this 6,000 years before writing, before cities, before any of the developments we associate with complex civilization. Mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical of the astronomical interpretation. The animals carved on Pillar 43, they argue, are more likely totemic or shamanic symbols. Many hunter-gatherer cultures associate particular animals with spiritual power, ancestral spirits, or mythological significance. The scorpion, vulture, and other creatures might represent clan symbols or supernatural beings rather than star patterns. The headless human could depict a mythological figure or ritual sacrifice. Without writing or other context, interpreting the carvings as an astronomical map requires assumptions about what the symbols meant to their creators. The problem of pattern recognition becomes relevant here. Human brains are evolved to find patterns, sometimes seeing meaningful connections where none exist. Ancient cultures worldwide created animal imagery that modern interpreters have variously read as constellations, spirits, hunting magic, or fertility symbols. Distinguishing between these interpretations without textual evidence is difficult. The animals on Pillar 43 could be constellations. They could equally be representations of animals important to the local ecosystem, depicted for reasons we no longer understand. There are details that complicate any simple interpretation. Göbekli Tepe contains multiple enclosures with numerous carved pillars, each displaying different imagery. If Pillar 43 is an astronomical map, what about the others? Do they also encode celestial information, or do they serve different functions? The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BC, intentionally filled in with debris and abandoned. Why would people invest enormous effort to build these structures and then carefully entomb them? This act suggests the enclosures had served their purpose, or that cultural changes made them obsolete or dangerous. The sheer age of Göbekli Tepe challenges assumptions about social organization in the Paleolithic. Building these enclosures required quarrying, transporting, carving, and erecting stones, weighing many tons without draft animals, without wheels, without metal tools. This implies a substantial workforce, coordination, and some form of leadership or collective decision-making. It also implies that hunter-gatherers in this region had sufficient food resources to support people working on construction rather than hunting and gathering full-time. Rich deposits of wild grain and game animals in the surrounding region could have provided this surplus. Some researchers propose that Göbekli Tepe represents the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution. Perhaps the desire to gather regularly at a sacred site encouraged people to settle nearby, leading gradually to agriculture and permanent villages. In this view, organized religion preceded rather than followed the development of farming. Monumental architecture came first, creating social structures that eventually produced agricultural society. The site continues to yield discoveries. Less than 5% has been excavated. Dozens of additional structures likely remain buried. Each excavation season reveals new carvings, new enclosures, new complications to our understanding of what these Stone Age people were trying to accomplish. Pillar 43's carvings could be humanity's oldest attempt to record astronomical events. They could be shamanic symbolism. They could be clan totems or mythological narratives. The pillar is stone, and the images are clear. The meaning, like so much at Göbekli Tepe, remains open to interpretation. What isn't open to debate is that 11,600 years ago, people were already thinking symbolically, building monumentally, and leaving messages we're still trying to read. From symbols carved in Turkey that may record cosmic events, we move to structures built in Peru that seem to encode mathematical constants. The circular plaza at Caral includes pi in its proportions, 3,000 years before the Greeks supposedly discovered it. In 2001, archaeologists confirmed the dating of Caral, a city in coastal Peru built around 3000 BC. It's the oldest known urban centre in the Americas, contemporary with Egypt's pyramids, and predating the Olmec civilization by roughly 1,500 years. The site had been known to local residents for decades, but systematic excavation and radiocarbon dating by Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady revealed its true age and significance. What Shady and her team found wasn't just an ancient city, but evidence of sophisticated planning that raises questions about mathematical knowledge in pre-literate societies. Caral sits in the Supe Valley, about 120 miles north of Lima. The site covers roughly 150 acres and includes multiple pyramid-like structures, residential areas, and large circular sunken plazas. The city appears to have been a ceremonial and administrative centre for a region that supported itself through agriculture, particularly cotton cultivation for fishing nets and maritime resources from the nearby Pacific coast. No evidence of warfare has been found at Caral. No defensive walls, no weapons, no signs of violent conflict. It seems to have been a peaceful urban centre focused on trade and ceremony. The architectural layout shows clear planning. 6 large pyramid structures are arranged around a central plaza. The pyramids aren't Egyptian-style pointed structures, but stepped platforms with flat tops, likely used for ceremonies. Residential areas are organised into distinct neighbourhoods. The circular sunken plazas, some measuring up to 50 feet in diameter, are positioned strategically throughout the complex. It's in these plazas that the mathematical puzzle appears. When researchers measured the circular plazas, they noticed something unexpected. The ratio between the diameter and circumference of several plazas approximated pi, the mathematical constant approximately equal to 3 times 1 feet 9. This ratio is fundamental to circular geometry. Any circle's circumference divided by its diameter equals pi. But did the builders of Caral know this? Or did they arrive at these proportions through some other process? The debate centers on intentionality. One interpretation holds that Carroll's architects possessed sophisticated mathematical understanding and deliberately incorporated pi into their designs. This would suggest theoretical knowledge of geometric principles comparable to what later civilizations developed. The alternative view argues that the builders worked intuitively, using methods like rope and stakes to lay out circles, naturally arriving at proportions that approximate pi without understanding the underlying mathematical constant. Distinguishing between these possibilities is difficult without written records. Carroll's culture left no writing system that we've identified. There are no mathematical treatises, no geometric diagrams, no explanations of architectural principles. The structures themselves are the only evidence. We can measure them, analyze their proportions, and observe that certain mathematical relationships appear in their design. What we cannot do is determine whether those relationships were understood abstractly or arrived at practically. To put this in perspective, the ancient Babylonians worked with approximations of pi by 1900 BC, calculating it as roughly 3.125. The Egyptians used an approximation of about 3.16 in their calculations by 1650 BC. The Greek mathematician Archimedes famously refined the calculation to between 3.408 and 3.429 around 250 BC. If Carroll's builders were consciously working with pi around 3000 BC, they predated these civilizations' documented mathematical investigations by centuries or millennia. Other mathematical features appear in Carroll's layout. The pyramids show proportions and symmetries that suggest careful planning. The largest pyramid measures roughly 500 by 450 feet at its base and rises about 60 feet high. Its sides and angles don't appear random but follow consistent patterns. The alignment of structures within the complex shows attention to cardinal directions, though not with the precision seen in Egyptian or Mesoamerican sites. All of this indicates a culture capable of planning, measuring, and executing large-scale construction with mathematical rigor. The absence of writing makes knowledge transmission a mystery. How did Carroll's architects learn their craft? How did they pass knowledge to apprentices? Most cultures with comparable architectural achievements, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, had writing systems that could record and transmit technical information. Carroll apparently managed without writing, relying entirely on oral tradition, physical models, or direct instruction. This is possible. Many traditional building techniques survive through demonstration and practice rather than written manuals, but it requires strong institutional continuity and probably specialized groups of builders who maintain standards across generations. Comparisons to contemporary civilizations highlight Carroll's anomalous position. Around 3000 BC, Egyptian pyramid construction was just beginning, with the step pyramid at Saqqara appearing around 2650 BC. Mesopotamian cities were well established, but most major monuments came later. The Indus Valley civilization was emerging but wouldn't reach its height for another few centuries. Carroll stands as one of the earliest urban centers anywhere in the world, yet it left no writing, no clear evidence of social hierarchy beyond what can be inferred from architecture, and no weapons or fortifications. Some researchers have proposed that Carroll's mathematical sophistication came from practical necessities. Building circular plazas requires measuring radius and circumference. After doing this repeatedly, builders might have noticed consistent ratios emerging, even if they didn't express these ratios as abstract mathematical constants. They could have developed rules of thumb, practical guidelines that worked without theoretical understanding. This is craft knowledge rather than mathematical knowledge, effective without being formalized. Yet the consistency of the proportions across multiple structures suggests more than accident. If different building teams working at different times all arrived at similar pi approximations, either they were following shared standards, or the method they used naturally produced those results. Either possibility implies a level of organization and standardization that goes beyond simple trial and error. The debate remains unresolved. Carroll's circular plazas incorporate ratios that approximate pi. Whether this represents intentional application of mathematical principles or intuitive building practices that produced mathematically significant proportions without theoretical understanding depends partly on how we define mathematical knowledge. Can practical understanding that produces correct results without abstract formulation be called mathematics? Or does mathematics require the theoretical framework that allows principles to be expressed and taught abstractly? What's clear is that Carroll's builders achieved something remarkable. They created one of the earliest cities in the world, organized large-scale construction projects, and produced architecture with mathematical properties we can measure and analyze 5,000 years later. They did this without writing, without wheels, without draft animals, and without metal tools. From mathematics encoded in stone, we turn to acoustics encoded in stone. At ancient sites from Malta to Mexico, chambers and corridors seem designed for specific sound resonances, accidental architecture, or intentional acoustic engineering. In Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, a subterranean temple carved from limestone around 3600 BC, there's a chamber called the Oracle Room. When someone speaks inside it, the sound resonates at 110 Hz throughout the entire complex. Modern acoustic analysis confirms this wasn't accidental. The chamber's dimensions, the curvature of its walls, and the density of the limestone combine to create a space that amplifies sound at that specific frequency. More intriguingly, the resonance responds more strongly to male voices, which naturally produce frequencies closer to 110 Hz than to female voices pitched higher. The hypogeum is extraordinary in multiple ways beyond its acoustics. Carved entirely into solid rock over several centuries, it descends through 3 levels, reaching about 10 meters underground. The chambers show sophisticated stone-cutting techniques, with some rooms featuring pillared halls and carved decorations that mimic above-ground temple architecture. The complex served as both temple and burial site, with the remains of more than 7,000 individuals found in its chambers. But it's the acoustic properties that have captured recent scientific attention. Studies conducted in the early 2000s by researcher Paolo De Bertolis and his team measured the resonance frequencies throughout the hypogeum. They found that 110 Hz dominated in the Oracle Room, but that resonance effects occurred throughout the structure. When sound is produced at this frequency, the entire complex vibrates slightly, creating an immersive acoustic experience. De Bertolis proposed that this frequency might have been deliberately incorporated for ritual purposes, as sound at 110 Hz can produce subtle effects on human brain activity. Research into the neurological effects of low-frequency sound has found that exposure to 110 Hz can temporarily alter activity in regions of the brain associated with language, emotion, and mood. The effects are subtle and not fully understood, but they're measurable. Some researchers suggest that ancient peoples might have discovered these effects empirically, noticing that chanting or speaking in certain spaces produced distinctive psychological or emotional states. If so, the acoustic design could have been intentional, created to enhance ritual experiences. The hypogeum isn't unique. Similar acoustic phenomena appear at ancient sites across different continents. At Chavín de Huántar in the Peruvian Andes, a temple complex dated to around 1200 BC incorporates stone ducts that channel and amplify sound. The ducts carry water flow noises and amplify the sound of conch shell trumpets, creating effects that would have been dramatic during ceremonies. Archaeologists studying the site have demonstrated that participants in the plaza below the temple would hear these sounds, apparently emanating from the stone itself. with no visible source. At Newgrange in Ireland, the prehistoric passage, tomb dated to around 3200 BC, shows acoustic properties in its long stone corridor. The passage amplifies certain frequencies while dampening others, creating a resonant chamber effect. When sounds are produced inside, particularly drumming or rhythmic chanting, the reverberations create an immersive acoustic environment. Whether this was intentional design or fortunate accident remains debated, but the effect is consistent and measurable. The cross-cultural appearance of acoustic features in sacred architecture suggests that ancient builders either discovered these properties independently in multiple locations, or that knowledge of acoustic principles spread through cultural contact. Either possibility indicates that sound was considered important enough in ritual contexts to influence architectural design. Modern concert halls use similar principles deliberately, shaping spaces to control how sound reflects, absorbs, and resonates. Ancient builders might have been doing the same thing, though through experimentation rather than theoretical acoustics. The challenge in interpreting these features is distinguishing between intentional design and happy accident. Stone chambers naturally create resonances. Certain shapes and sizes will amplify particular frequencies simply due to physics. The question isn't whether the acoustic effects exist, they're measurable and reproducible. The question is whether ancient architects understood what they were creating and deliberately shaped spaces to achieve acoustic goals. Evidence for intentionality includes the consistency of the effects. The Oracle Room's resonance at 110 Hz is remarkably stable, suggesting the dimensions were carefully controlled. At Charvin, the stone ducts were clearly built to channel sound. They serve no other obvious function. At Newgrange, the passage dimensions create resonance patterns that wouldn't occur with randomly chosen proportions. These features suggest planning and purpose rather than coincidence. Yet without written records describing acoustic design principles or oral traditions preserving knowledge of sound engineering, we're interpreting from effects alone. The Hypogeum's builders left no explanation of why they carved the Oracle Room in its specific shape. Charvin's architects didn't document their intentions with the sound ducts. The passage tomb builders at Newgrange inscribed spiral patterns on stones, but nothing that clearly indicates acoustic knowledge. There are practical reasons ancient peoples might have paid attention to acoustics beyond ritual enhancement. In large gathering spaces, natural amplification would help voices carry to audiences. In dark underground chambers, sound could help people navigate and communicate. The acoustic properties might have served functional purposes that later became associated with spiritual significance when people noticed that certain spaces felt different, sounded different, produced unusual psychological effects. The 110 Hz frequency at the Hypogeum has particular significance because it sits at the edge of what's called infrasound, frequencies below the normal range of human hearing. While 110 Hz is audible, it's low enough that people might perceive it as much through vibration as through hearing. This creates a physical sensation accompanying the sound, potentially contributing to the sense that something unusual or supernatural was occurring in that space. Modern experiments recreating the acoustic conditions of these ancient sites have confirmed that the effects are powerful. Participants standing in reconstructed chambers report feelings of awe, disorientation, or altered perception when exposed to the resonance frequencies. Whether ancient peoples deliberately created these effects or discovered them by accident and then incorporated them into ritual practice, the result was architecture that engaged multiple senses and potentially altered consciousness in ways that reinforced the sacred nature of these spaces. What we can say definitively is that ancient builders at multiple sites across the ancient world created spaces with specific acoustic properties. The physics of those properties is measurable and reproducible. What remains uncertain is the extent to which these features were understood, planned, and intentionally incorporated versus accidentally discovered and subsequently valued. The spaces themselves endure their acoustic signatures still detectable millennia later, evidence of attention to sound in sacred architecture, whether that attention came from acoustic theory or empirical observation. From chambers designed for sound, we move to objects designed for something we can't identify. In museums across Europe sit dozens of small bronze dodecahedrons, geometric objects with holes and knobs that have puzzled archaeologists for 300 years. No one knows what they were for. They sit in museum cases across France, Germany, and Britain. Small bronze objects with 12 pentagonal faces, each face containing a circular hole of different size and each vertex capped with a knob. About 100 have been found since the first discovery in 1739. Not one ancient text mentions them. No Roman artwork depicts them. No inscription explains their purpose. They are artifacts without context, objects that clearly required skill and expense to produce, but whose function has been completely forgotten. The dodecahedrons date to the Roman period, specifically the 2nd through 4th centuries AD. They're found almost exclusively in the northern provinces of the empire, concentrated in Gaul, Germania, and Britain, the regions roughly corresponding to modern France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the British Isles. Curiously, they don't appear in Mediterranean Rome itself or in the eastern provinces. This regional distribution suggests they served some purpose specific to the northern frontier rather than being a pan-Roman phenomenon. Each dodecahedron is roughly the size of a baseball or orange, though dimensions vary. Some are small enough to fit in a pocket. Others are larger, more substantial. All share the same basic form. 12 flat pentagonal faces, circular holes of varying diameter on each face, and knobs or protrusions at each of the 20 vertices where faces meet. The holes aren't random. They follow a pattern with opposite faces typically having similar-sized holes, creating a kind of symmetry through the object. The craftsmanship indicates these weren't casual creations. Bronze casting requires expertise. The metal must be melted, poured into molds, allowed to cool, and then finished. Achieving the geometric precision of a dodecahedron, a relatively complex three-dimensional shape, suggests skilled metalworkers familiar with mathematical forms. Bronze was also valuable, using it for objects whose purpose was important enough to justify the material cost and labour investment. Yet no two dodecahedrons are identical. They show individual variations in size, in the specific diameters of the holes, in the style of the knobs, and in decorative details. Some have simple spherical knobs. Others feature more elaborate knob shapes. A few have inscriptions or decorative marks, though none that clearly indicate function. This variation suggests each was individually made rather than mass-produced, perhaps customized for specific users or purposes. The theories about their use are remarkably diverse. Some researchers propose they were surveying instruments used to measure distances or angles in land surveying or military engineering. The varying hole sizes could have served as sighting aids for measuring objects at different distances. Others suggest they were astronomical calculators, perhaps for determining dates or tracking celestial movements, with the holes corresponding to angular measurements of stars or planets. Candlestick holders have been proposed, with the knobs serving as feet and the holes allowing candles of different sizes to be inserted. This seems practical, but doesn't explain why such holders would need the dodecahedral shape, or why they appear only in northern provinces. Dice for gaming is another theory, though the dodecahedron's complexity seems excessive for simple gambling, and no ancient game involving 12-sided objects is documented. Military applications have been suggested. Could they have been range-finding devices used to estimate distances to enemy formations? Or perhaps they calibrated the trajectories of siege weapons like catapults and ballistae. The problem with military theories is that Roman military manuals and histories describe many specialized tools and equipment, but never mention dodecahedrons. You'd expect something used routinely in military campaigns to appear in the extensive Roman literature on warfare. Religious or ritual uses are possible. The objects might have been votive offerings, ceremonial items used in Celtic or Romano-Celtic religious practices, specific to the northern provinces. The knobs could have held sacred items, or the dodecahedrons could have been ritual objects whose meaning was deliberately kept secret from outsiders, explaining why Romans never wrote about them. This theory has the advantage of explaining both the limited geographic distribution and the lack of written references. Children's toys or puzzle objects have been proposed, though the bronze material and careful craftsmanship seem excessive for playthings. Knitting or weaving aids with the holes and knobs used to create specific thread patterns have been suggested based on experiments showing they could function this way. But there's no historical evidence that Romans in these provinces knitted. The technique wasn't documented in Europe until the medieval period. The archaeological contexts where dodecahedrons have been found provide limited help. Some were discovered in graves, suggesting they had personal significance to the deceased. Others come from hoards, collections of valuable objects buried and never recovered. Still others were found in domestic settings or dumped in refuse pits, implying they were mundane enough to be discarded. The variety of contexts makes it difficult to determine a single function. Modern experiments have tested many theories. Museums and researchers have attempted to use replica dodecahedrons as surveying tools, astronomical devices, and various other proposed functions. Some work after a fashion, though none work so well that the purpose becomes obvious. The dodecahedrons can function as many things, which makes determining their actual purpose difficult. The regional distribution remains one of the strongest clues. Why northern provinces only? Perhaps they're connected to Celtic culture, which remained influential in Gaul and Britain even under Roman rule. Perhaps they relate to climate, serving some function relevant to northern weather that Mediterranean regions didn't need. Or perhaps they were the product of a specific tradition or cult that flourished in these areas but didn't spread to other parts of the empire. The complete absence from Roman literature is perhaps the most frustrating aspect. Romans wrote about everything. They described tools, games, religious practices, curiosities, and technologies in detail. Yet nowhere in surviving Latin texts does anyone mention small bronze dodecahedrons. Either the objects were so common that no one thought to describe them, like describing a modern paperclip, or they were known by a term we don't recognize, or their use was considered secret or unimportant. Roman dodecahedrons represent a complete gap in our understanding. We have roughly 100 physical examples. We can measure them, analyze the bronze composition, date them to specific centuries, and map where they were found. What we cannot do is explain with certainty what they were for. Dozens of theories exist, some plausible, some creative, none definitive. After nearly 3 centuries of scholarly attention, the dodecahedrons remain among Roman archaeology's most enduring puzzles. Roman objects with no known purpose lead us to Roman objects with impossible properties. The Lycurgus cup changes colour depending on light direction, an effect modern materials science calls nanotechnology. The Romans made it in the 4th century AD. In the British Museum sits a Roman glass cage cup from the 4th century AD. Under normal light, it appears greenish. When light shines through it from behind, it glows ruby red. This dichromatic property, the ability to display different colours depending on light direction, is created through nanoparticles suspended in the glass. Modern materials scientists didn't figure out how to produce this effect intentionally until the 1990s. Yet someone in late antiquity created it more than 600 years earlier. The cup itself is a masterpiece, even before considering its optical properties. It's a cage cup, a style of Roman glassware where the outer surface is carved away to create an openwork design that appears to float around the vessel. The technique, called diatretum, required extraordinary skill. The glassmaker had to carve through the outer layer without breaking the thin inner vessel, creating an effect like stone carving, but in a medium far more fragile. Only a handful of complete cage cups survive, testament to both their rarity in antiquity and their fragility over the centuries. The Lycurgus cup depicts a mythological scene. King Lycurgus of Thrace is shown entangled in grapevines, being killed by the god Dionysus as punishment for opposing the wine cult. The figures are carved in relief into the openwork cage, creating a three-dimensional narrative visible from all angles. The craftsmanship alone would make this an exceptional artifact. The colour-changing property makes it extraordinary. When researchers first analysed the cup in 1990, they assumed the colour change resulted from some chemical treatment or coating. Microscopic examination revealed something unexpected. The glass contained tiny particles of gold and silver, each approximately 50 nanometers in diameter. These nanoparticles are dispersed throughout the glass matrix at a concentration of about 330 parts per million. They're far too small to be seen individually, but collectively they create the dichromatic effect through a phenomenon called surface plasmon resonance. Surface plasmon resonance is a quantum physics effect. When light hits metal nanoparticles of specific sizes, the electrons on the particle surfaces oscillate in ways that absorb certain wavelengths while reflecting or transmitting others. The exact wavelengths affected depend on the particle size, shape, and the surrounding medium. In the Lycurgus cup, the gold and silver nanoparticles are sized precisely to absorb green wavelengths in reflected light, making the cup appear greenish while allowing red wavelengths to pass through in transmitted light, creating the ruby glow. Modern nanotechnology uses this principle for applications ranging from biosensors to solar cells. The fact that ancient Romans created the same effect raises obvious questions. How they do it? Was it intentional or accidental? If intentional, what did they understand about the physics? The most likely explanation involves a fortunate accident during glassmaking. Adding small amounts of gold or silver to molten glass was a known technique for colouring. If the metal was ground extremely fine and mixed into the glass under specific temperature conditions, nanoparticles could form. The glassmaker might not have understood why the result was dichromatic, only that this particular recipe produced a desirable and unusual effect. Once discovered, the technique could be replicated, though apparently with difficulty, since no other Roman glass shows quite the same properties. Yet calling it purely accidental may underestimate Roman craftsmen. Glassmaking in the late Empire was sophisticated. Roman glassmakers produced a wide range of colours, created complex multi-layered vessels, and understood how different additives affected the final product. They worked through trial and error, accumulating knowledge about what worked without necessarily understanding the underlying chemistry. A glassmaker who discovered that a specific amount of gold, ground to extreme fineness, created this colour-changing effect might have deliberately refined the process. The cage cup form adds another layer of technical achievement. Creating the openwork required patience and exceptional skill. The glass had to be thick enough initially to allow carving, but thin enough in the final vessel to transmit light effectively. Combining this difficult form with the experimental glass composition that produces the dichromatic effect suggests deliberate artistry rather than pure chance. Analysis of the gold-silver ratio in the nanoparticles shows that it's approximately 70% silver and 30% gold. This specific ratio might have been discovered empirically to produce the optimal color shift. Different ratios would create different optical effects. That the Lycurgus cups ratio produces such a dramatic red transmission suggests the craftsman was working toward a specific visual goal. The cup's mythological scene adds meaning to the color shift. Dionysus was the god of wine, transformation, and altered states. A vessel that itself transforms, shifting from green to glowing red like wine catching light, perfectly embodies Dionysian themes. Whether this symbolism was intentional or the scene was chosen to match an already existing remarkable cup, the combination is striking. No other Roman glass exactly replicates the Lycurgus cup's effect, though this might reflect survival bias rather than true uniqueness. Hundreds of thousands of Roman glass vessels existed. Only a tiny fraction survives intact. Other dichromatic cups might have existed and been lost. Or the technique might have been so difficult, requiring such precise conditions and materials that successful examples were rare even in antiquity. Modern attempts to recreate the effect using ancient methods have had mixed results. Researchers can produce dichromatic glass using nanoparticles, but achieving the exact colors and intensity of the original requires careful control of particle size and distribution. This control is easier with modern equipment than with Roman furnaces and techniques, suggesting that ancient craftsmen who achieved this effect possessed exceptional skill or fortunate circumstances. The Lycurgus cup currently resides in the British Museum, where it's displayed with careful lighting to show both the reflected green and transmitted red colours. Visitors can see the same effect that amazed people 1,600 years ago. The physics has been explained, the nanoparticles have been measured, the mechanism is understood. What remains unclear is how much the Roman craftsmen understood of what they were creating. Ancient glassmaking was partly craft, partly art, and partly experiment. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and refined through generations of practice. A technique that produced remarkable results would be valued and preserved even if the practitioners couldn't explain why it worked. The Lycurgus cup demonstrates that practical knowledge can achieve effects we associate with advanced scientific understanding. From glass that changes colour, we move to metal that doesn't rust. In Delhi stands an iron pillar from the 4th century AD that has resisted corrosion for 1,600 years despite monsoon rains. The metallurgy behind it puzzled scientists for decades. Near the Qutb Minar in Delhi stands a 7-metre iron pillar installed around 400 AD during the Gupta Empire. For 1,600 years, it has stood through monsoons and humidity. It shows almost no rust. Modern iron exposed to Delhi's climate would be corroded and pitted within decades. This pillar remains smooth and largely intact, bearing only a thin coating that has actually protected rather than degraded the metal beneath. The pillar is a single piece of wrought iron, weighing approximately 6 tons. A Sanskrit inscription near the top dedicates it to Vishnu and commemorates a king named Chandra, likely Chandragupta II, who ruled from roughly 380 to 415 AD. The inscription provides dating but says nothing about the pillar's construction or the techniques used to prevent corrosion. For centuries, the pillar stood as a curiosity. Local tradition held that anyone who could stand with their back to the pillar and reach their arms around to touch their hands behind it would have good fortune. This folk practice actually damaged the inscription through countless touches, but it also drew attention to the pillar's unusual properties. Modern scientific interest began in the 20th century when materials scientists recognized that the pillar's resistance to rust was extraordinary. Iron oxidizes readily in the presence of moisture and oxygen, forming iron oxide, rust, which weakens the metal and eventually destroys it. Every iron structure requires protective measures: paint, galvanization, or regular replacement. The Delhi pillar required none of these, yet survived in exposed conditions for a millennium and a half. Initial analyses in the mid-20th century noted the iron's unusual purity, but couldn't fully explain the corrosion resistance. Later studies using more sophisticated techniques revealed the answer. In 2002, researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology Kanpur published findings identifying the protective mechanism. The iron contains approximately 1% phosphorus, significantly higher than modern iron, which typically contains 0.05% or less. This elevated phosphorus content, combined with the pillar's exposure to Delhi's alternating wet and dry climate, creates a thin protective layer of misohyte, a compound of iron, oxygen, and hydrogen that forms a crystalline coating over the metal surface. Misohyte is stable and adherent. Unlike rust, which flakes off and exposes fresh metal to further corrosion, misohyte stays put. It forms gradually through a chemical reaction between the iron, phosphorus, and atmospheric moisture. Once established, the coating protects the underlying metal from further oxidation. The process is self-limiting. The coating doesn't grow indefinitely, but reaches a stable thickness of about 600 microns and then stops, having sealed the surface completely. The phosphorus content was probably not accidental. Gupta-era ironworkers were renowned for their skill. They produced high-quality iron and steel, including the famous Damascus pattern Wootz steel that was exported across the ancient world. The iron ore sources available in India naturally contained higher phosphorus levels than European or Chinese ores. Smelting techniques used in the Gupta period would have retained much of this phosphorus in the final product, unlike later industrial processes that deliberately remove phosphorus because it can make iron brittle if present in excessive amounts. The forging technique also contributed to the pillar's durability. The pillar wasn't cast in a single pour, but built up through a process called hammer welding. Smaller pieces of iron were heated and hammered together, gradually building the pillar's mass. This technique created a very pure iron with minimal slag inclusions. The hammer welding process also coated the surface with a thin layer of slag, which provided additional initial protection, while the misohyte coating formed. What makes the Delhi pillar particularly impressive is that this level of corrosion resistance wasn't matched in Europe until modern metallurgy developed stainless steel in the early 20th century. Medieval and early modern European ironwork routinely corroded. Iron gates, weapons, tools, and structures all required constant maintenance or eventual replacement. The knowledge of how to produce corrosion-resistant iron either never developed in Europe or was lost if it ever existed. Meanwhile, this single pillar stood in Delhi, demonstrating that ancient Indian metallurgists had solved a problem that would challenge materials science for centuries. The question of intentionality remains. Did Gupta ironworkers understand that high phosphorus content would prevent rust, or did they simply discover empirically that iron from certain sources lasted longer and used it preferentially for important projects? The distinction matters less than the result. Whether through theoretical understanding or practical experience, they produced a material with properties that modern engineering would admire. Other iron objects from the Gupta period show similar, though less dramatic corrosion resistance. Smaller items have been found that display the same protective phosphorus coating. This suggests the Delhi pillar wasn't a unique fluke but an example of a broader metallurgical tradition. The pillar survives because of its size and the protection afforded by being a religious monument, but the technology it represents was probably more widespread than the surviving examples indicate. The pillar's original purpose was likely as a Dvaja Stamba, a flagpole or standard that would have stood before a temple. The Gupta period saw considerable temple construction, and pillars like this serve both functional and symbolic purposes. The dedication to Vishnu and the commemorative inscription elevated it from a simple, utilitarian object to a monument of royal patronage. This status probably contributed to its preservation through subsequent centuries, as later rulers respected its religious significance even when the original temple it accompanied disappeared. Attempts to replicate the Delhi pillar using ancient techniques have had mixed success. Modern metallurgists can produce iron with similar phosphorus content and can induce misoite formation through controlled exposure to humidity. What's harder to replicate is the hammer welding technique that created the pillar's specific microstructure. Ancient ironworkers developed intuitive understanding of how heat, hammering, and metal purity affected the final product. Translating that intuitive knowledge into modern metallurgical practice requires experimental archaeology and educated guesswork. The pillar stands today as a protected monument, enclosed by a fence to prevent the touching that once damaged the inscription. It remains smooth and dark, the misoite coating continuing to protect it, as it has for 1,600 years. The phosphorus that makes it special was probably abundant in the ore used. The techniques that shaped it were standard for Gupta ironworking. Yet the combination produced something that has outlasted empires and remains a testament to ancient Indian metallurgical sophistication. From iron that doesn't rust, we move to metal that shouldn't generate electricity. In Iraq, archaeologists found clay jars with copper and iron rods, objects dated to 200 BC that look suspiciously like galvanic cells. Were ancient Mesopotamians generating electricity? In 1936, while excavating near Baghdad, German archaeologist Wilhelm König found a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. The configuration looked like a battery. The jar stood about 5 inches tall, with a copper cylinder inside, sealed at the bottom with asphalt. The iron rod passed through an asphalt stopper at the top, positioned so it didn't touch the copper. When replicated with acidic liquid like vinegar or citrus juice filling the jar, the device generates about 1 volt of electricity. König proposed that ancient Parthians might have used similar devices for electroplating jewellery, coating base metals with thin layers of gold. The find wasn't unique. Archaeologists have uncovered at least 10 similar jars in the Baghdad region and nearby areas, all dated to the Parthian period, around 200 BC to 200 AD. The jars show consistent construction: clay vessels, copper cylinders, iron rods, asphalt sealant. The consistency suggests intentional design rather than random assembly. Someone made these objects deliberately, following a pattern for some purpose. The battery interpretation emerged from König's observation that the configuration matched a simple galvanic cell. When 2 dissimilar metals, copper and iron, are placed in an electrolyte solution without touching each other, a chemical reaction generates electrical current. The acidic liquid acts as the electrolyte, allowing ions to flow between the metals and creating voltage. Modern replications have confirmed this works. Fill a Baghdad jar with vinegar, insert the copper cylinder and iron rod properly, and you get measurable voltage. König's electroplating theory proposed that Parthian jewelers used these devices to create gold-plated items. Some jewelry from the period shows gilding that could theoretically have been achieved through electroplating, where electrical current deposits metal ions onto a surface. If Parthians could generate electricity, even small amounts, they might have discovered electroplating empirically without understanding the underlying electrochemistry. The theory faces significant problems. No ancient texts describe electrical phenomena. No wires have been found that could connect multiple jars to achieve useful voltage. No clearly electroplated objects from this period have been definitively identified. Gilding can be achieved through other techniques like mercury amalgam or gold leaf application, both of which were known in antiquity. Most importantly, using these devices for electroplating would require not just generating electricity, but understanding how to apply it, which involves concepts that weren't formalized until the 18th and 19th centuries. Mainstream archaeology is skeptical. The leading alternative interpretation is that the jars stored scrolls. The copper cylinders could have protected papyrus or parchment from humidity and insects. The asphalt sealant would keep moisture out. The iron rods might have been added later, perhaps by people reusing the jars for different purposes. In this view, the battery-like configuration is coincidental, an artifact of preservation methods that happen to resemble an electrical device. Other theories suggest religious purposes. The jars might have been used for storing sacred liquids or as ritual objects whose function we don't understand. Parthian religion incorporated practices from multiple traditions, Mesopotamian, Persian, and Greek influences. Ritual objects whose purpose seems obscure to us might have been perfectly clear to practitioners at the time. There are intriguing details that keep the battery hypothesis alive despite skepticism. The consistency of construction across multiple examples suggests intentional design. If these were simply storage jars, why the copper cylinder and iron rod combination? Why asphalt at both top and bottom? The specific configuration, while possibly coincidental, requires several choices that together create a functional battery. Modern experiments have explored what the devices could do if they were batteries. Television's Mythbusters tested replicas and confirmed voltage generation. They connected multiple jars in series to increase voltage and demonstrated that, theoretically, enough jars could produce current sufficient for electroplating, though it would require dozens arranged in specific configurations. Whether ancient people actually did this remains unproven. The electrochemical reaction that generates current would consume the metals gradually. The iron rod would corrode and the copper would degrade. If these devices were used regularly as batteries, the metals would need periodic replacement. No archaeological evidence shows mass production of replacement rods or copper cylinders, which you'd expect if batteries were common tools. Context from the excavation sites is limited. Many Baghdad batteries were found in contexts that were already disturbed or incompletely documented. The original excavations in the 1930s and 1940s didn't anticipate the battery hypothesis, so excavators didn't record details about surrounding materials that might clarify the jar's function. This makes reconstructing their use challenging. The absence of electrical understanding in ancient texts is significant. Parthian and later Sasanian Persian cultures had sophisticated astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. They left texts describing many technologies and scientific observations. Electricity, however, isn't mentioned. If they were generating and using electrical current, even for limited purposes, you'd expect some description to survive, even if the underlying physics wasn't understood. The silence suggests either the devices weren't used electrically, or their use was so mundane it didn't merit recording. An analogy might help clarify the uncertainty. Imagine archaeologists in the distant future finding a modern glass jar with a metal lid and wire attached. The configuration could theoretically be part of an electrical circuit. Does that mean it was, or was it a storage container whose components happened to be conductive? Without context, determining actual use from theoretical possibility is difficult. The Baghdad batteries remain controversial. They could generate electricity, that's been tested. Whether they were used for that purpose is another question entirely. The objects exist in museums. The debate continues. Some researchers maintain the electroplating hypothesis has merit, pointing to the consistent construction and the theoretical possibility. Others argue that without evidence of wires, electroplated objects, or textual descriptions, interpreting these as batteries requires assumptions unsupported by the archaeological context. For now, the Baghdad batteries occupy an ambiguous space. They're not batteries in the sense of deliberate electrical devices, according to most archaeologists. But they're not definitively proven to be scroll storage or ritual vessels either. They're artifacts that could have functioned as batteries, found in ancient contexts, with no clear explanation for their actual purpose. From ancient surgery that somehow worked, we turn to ancient navigation that shouldn't have been possible. In museums across Peru sit human skulls with neat circular or rectangular holes cut directly through the bone. The edges show healing, new bone growth around the opening. These people had their skulls deliberately opened, and they survived. Trepanation, the practice of drilling or cutting holes into the skull of a living person, appears in multiple ancient Peruvian cultures. The Paracas, Nazca, Wari, and Inca all performed the procedure over a span of roughly 2,000 years, from about 500 BC to 1500 AD. What makes this remarkable isn't that they attempted skull surgery. Various ancient cultures did that. What's remarkable is how often their patients lived through it. A 2018 study analysing more than 800 trepan skulls from ancient Peru found survival rates between 75% and 83%, depending on the time period. Survival is determined by examining whether new bone growth appears around the surgical opening. If the edges show signs of healing, remodeling, and integration with surrounding bone tissue, the patient lived for at least several weeks after the procedure, long enough for the healing process to begin. Some skulls show complete healing, indicating patients survived for years after surgery. These survival rates are extraordinary for any era, but particularly for the pre-antibiotic ancient world. To put this in perspective, trepanation, performed during the American Civil War, more than 1,000 years later, and with access to metal surgical tools and at least basic understanding of hygiene, had survival rates around 50% to 60%. Ancient Peruvian surgeons using stone tools and no germ theory saved 3 out of 4 patients. The techniques varied between cultures and evolved over time. The earliest trepanations from the Paracas period show survival rates around 40%. By the time of the Inca Empire, survival rates had climbed above 80%. This improvement suggests accumulation of surgical knowledge, refinement of techniques, and probably better post-operative care. Ancient Peruvian surgeons learned from experience, passed knowledge to apprentices, and gradually developed methods that maximized patient survival. 4 main techniques have been identified. Scraping involved using a sharp stone to gradually abrade bone in a circular pattern until the skull was penetrated. This was slow but relatively controlled. Drilling used a pointed tool rotated to create a series of small holes arranged in a circle or square, which could then be connected by breaking the bone segments between holes. Sawing cut grooves into the bone using a sharp-edged tool drawn back and forth. Cutting involved using a blade, probably obsidian, to score the bone and gradually deepen the cut until penetrating the skull. The choice of technique seems to have shifted over time. Earlier surgeons favoured scraping, which was safer but time-consuming. Later periods show more drilling and cutting, techniques that were faster but required greater skill to avoid damaging the brain beneath. The improvement in survival rates, despite the shift to potentially riskier techniques, suggests surgeons became more adept, developing steady hands and precise judgment about how deep to cut. Why perform trepanation at all? The most likely reasons involve treating head trauma. Ancient Peru, particularly the Inca Empire, saw considerable warfare. Soldiers received head wounds from clubs, slings, and other weapons. Depressed skull fractures, where broken bone is pushed inward toward the brain, would cause pressure, swelling, and often death without intervention. Trepanation could relieve pressure, remove bone fragments, and drain blood clots. Modern neurosurgery performs similar procedures for similar reasons. Some trepan skulls show evidence of infection or disease, suggesting surgeons also operated on patients suffering from chronic headaches, seizures, or mental disorders. Whether surgery helped these conditions is doubtful, but the attempt indicates a belief that opening the skull could address various problems. Other skulls show trepanations near healed wounds from earlier injuries, suggesting surgeons operated on long-term complications from trauma. The tools were primarily obsidian blades and later bronze implements. Obsidian volcanic glass can be flaked to create edges sharper than modern surgical scalpels. Bronze tools appeared with the rise of metallurgy in the Andes, but were probably supplemented by obsidian for the finest cutting. The surgeons had steady hands, sharp tools, and hard-won knowledge of skull anatomy. Pain management remains a question. The patients presumably had no effective anesthesia. Coca leaves, which contain cocaine precursors, were widely used in the Andes and might have provided some pain relief or, at least, psychological comfort. Alcohol from chicha, fermented corn beer, might have been employed. But skull surgery without anesthesia would still be excruciating. That patients survived not just the procedure, but the shock and pain speaks to either remarkable stoicism or the effectiveness of whatever pain management techniques were used. Post-operative care must have been crucial to the high survival rates. Keeping the wound clean, preventing infection, and monitoring the patient during recovery would all influence outcomes. Without antibiotics, infection was a constant risk. Some evidence suggests ancient Peruvians used plant-based antiseptics. Certain herbs native to the region have antimicrobial properties. Whether surgeons deliberately used these or simply followed practices that happened to reduce infection is unknown. Multiple surgeries on the same individual appear in some skulls. A few show 2, 3, or even more trepanations performed at different times, all with evidence of healing. This indicates patients not only survived the first surgery, but recovered well enough to undergo subsequent procedures, and that surgeons were willing to operate multiple times on the same person. It suggests a level of confidence in the procedure and in the ability to keep patients alive through repeated trauma. The geographical distribution of trepan skulls shows the practice wasn't limited to elite centres, but occurred throughout the Andean highlands. Both men and women underwent trepanation, though males predominate in the archaeological sample, possibly reflecting higher rates of combat-related head injuries. Social status doesn't seem to have been a barrier. Skulls from both elaborate and simple burials show trepanation, suggesting the surgery was available across social classes. Comparisons to European trepanation highlight the Andean achievement. Medieval and Renaissance European surgeons also performed trepanation, but with much lower success rates. European survival rates didn't match Peruvian levels until the late 19th or early 20th century, after antiseptic procedures and better surgical techniques were developed. Ancient Peruvian surgeons, working without modern advantages, achieved results that wouldn't be equaled in Europe for more than 1,000 years. The skulls themselves are the evidence. Bone doesn't lie. The surgical openings, the healing patterns, and the survival rates are all measurable. What's missing is the knowledge system behind the achievement. How did surgeons learn where to cut? How did they know when to stop? What post-operative protocols did they follow? The practitioners are long gone, their techniques unrecorded, but their results speak clearly across the centuries. From ancient surgery that somehow worked, we turn to ancient navigation that shouldn't have been possible. Viking sagas mention mysterious sunstones that could find the sun even when clouds covered the sky. For centuries, historians dismissed this as myth. Then in 2013, researchers tested calcite crystals with polarized light. The stones work. The sagas, Iceland's medieval prose narratives, recording Viking Age events and legends, occasionally mention a navigational tool called a solarstein, or sunstone. The most detailed reference appears in the saga of King Olaf, where the stone is used to locate the sun's position during overcast conditions. The account describes the navigator holding the stone up, looking through it at the clouded sky and determining the sun's direction, even though the sun itself wasn't visible. For generations, scholars treated this as fantasy, a magical device that couldn't possibly function as described. The dismissal made sense given what historians knew about Viking navigation. The Norse didn't have magnetic compasses, which weren't introduced to Europe until the 12th century, after the Viking Age had ended. They navigated using the sun and stars when visible, coastal landmarks when available, and dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, time, and direction when other references weren't accessible. But they also made remarkable voyages. Vikings reached Iceland around 870 AD, established settlements in Greenland by 985 AD, and reached Newfoundland around 1000 AD. These weren't short coastal hops, but open ocean crossings of hundreds or even thousands of miles. The Sunstone mystery remained dormant until optical physicists began exploring whether the saga descriptions might have a basis in natural phenomena. Iceland spar, a form of transparent calcite crystal found in Iceland and Scandinavia, exhibits a property called strong double refraction. When light passes through the crystal, it splits into two rays that travel at different speeds and emerge at slightly different angles. This creates a double image when you look through the crystal at an object. More significantly for navigation, calcite crystals can detect polarized light. Sunlight becomes partially polarized as it passes through Earth's atmosphere. Even on overcast days when the sun isn't directly visible, the pattern of polarization in the sky reveals the sun's position. A calcite crystal, rotated and observed carefully, shows changes in the relative intensity of the double images based on the polarization angle of incoming light. An experienced navigator who understood this effect could use the crystal to determine where the sun was located behind the clouds. In 2013, researchers led by Guy Ropars at the University of Rennes published a study testing whether this technique could work practically. They conducted experiments simulating Viking navigation conditions using calcite crystals to determine sun position under various cloud covers and at different solar elevations. The results showed that skilled users could locate the sun's position to within about 5 degrees of accuracy, sufficient for maintaining course on long ocean voyages. The technique worked even at twilight, when the sun was below the horizon but its light still polarized the sky. The study didn't prove Vikings used sunstones, but it demonstrated that the saga descriptions weren't impossible. A tool that seemed magical, when taken literally, turned out to be explainable through optical physics. Whether Vikings understood the physics or simply discovered empirically that certain crystals helped with navigation remained an open question, but the feasibility was established. Then in 2013, another piece of evidence surfaced. Researchers analysing a 16th century shipwreck discovered off Alderney in the Channel Islands found a calcite crystal among the navigational instruments. The ship dated to 1592, well after the Viking Age, but still in an era when magnetic compasses were available. Why would a navigator carry a calcite crystal if sunstones were merely myth? The presence of the crystal on a real navigation-era ship suggested the technique might have had practical use, and perhaps had been passed down through maritime tradition from earlier periods. The Alderney crystal was found near other navigation tools, suggesting it was part of the ship's equipment rather than random cargo. Its size and quality made it suitable for the kind of observations the sunstone technique required. While this doesn't prove Vikings used such crystals 500 years earlier, it demonstrates that polarization-based navigation using calcite was practiced by later European sailors, giving credibility to the possibility that earlier mariners knew the technique. Iceland spar was readily available in the Norse world. The crystals occur naturally in volcanic regions, particularly Iceland itself. Vikings wouldn't have needed to import exotic materials. They would have encountered these crystals regularly and might have noticed their optical properties. The leap from observing that crystals create double images to using them for navigation would require experimentation and insight, but it's within the realm of what maritime cultures accomplish through generations of accumulated knowledge. The saga references to sunstones are brief and don't provide detailed instructions for use. This could mean the technique was either so common that detailed explanation was unnecessary, like describing how to use a compass today, or that the sagas were recording a practice that was already becoming rare or mysterious to their authors. The sagas were written in the 13th and 14th centuries, recording events from the 9th through 11th centuries. By the time of writing, the Viking Age was over, and navigational practices might have changed. Other Viking navigational achievements support the possibility that they had sophisticated methods. They navigated reliably enough to maintain trade routes and settlement contacts across vast ocean distances. They timed voyages seasonally and understood wind patterns and ocean currents. Their ships were designed for open ocean travel. Having a technique for determining sun position during overcast conditions would fit into this broader pattern of navigational competence. Yet the evidence remains circumstantial. No sunstone has been definitively identified from a Viking archaeological context. The saga references a few and lack technical detail. The Alderney crystal dates to 5 centuries after the Viking Age. The 2013 experimental validation proves the technique could work, not that it was used. Mainstream acceptance of Viking sunstones has grown, but remains cautious. The mystery is whether saga accounts preserved memory of a real technique, or whether later researchers reverse-engineered a plausible explanation for what might have been literary embellishment. The physics works, the materials were available, and the navigational need existed. But without finding a crystal in a Viking ship or a saga passage that describes the technique in unmistakable detail, the connection remains probable rather than proven. Between 1200 BC and 1200 AD, Polynesian navigators settled every habitable island in the Pacific Triangle, an area covering roughly 10 million square miles. They did this without compasses, without maps, without sextants. They used only observation, memory, and an understanding of ocean patterns we're only beginning to appreciate. The scale of this achievement is difficult to grasp. Imagine setting out from Tahiti in a double-hulled voyaging canoe, navigating 2,400 miles of open ocean to reach Hawaii, a tiny archipelago in the vast Pacific. You have no instruments to measure position, no charts showing the way, no radio to call for help if you sail past your destination. You navigate by reading stars, feeling swells, watching birds, and interpreting cloud formations. Generations of Polynesian navigators did exactly this and succeeded often enough to establish permanent settlements across the world's largest ocean. The settlement pattern itself tells a story. Archaeological and linguistic evidence traces Polynesian origins to Taiwan and the Philippines, from where ancestors of Polynesians moved into the Western Pacific around 1500 BC. By 1200 BC, they'd reached Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. From there, the great age of Pacific exploration began. The Marquesas were settled around 300 AD, Hawaii around 400 AD, Easter Island around 800 AD, and New Zealand around 1200 AD. Each jump required crossing hundreds or thousands of miles of ocean, often against prevailing winds and currents, implying deliberate voyaging rather than accidental drift. The navigational methods relied on multiple information sources synthesized into a mental map of ocean space. Star paths formed the primary directional system. Navigators memorized the rising and setting positions of specific stars at different latitudes. By tracking which stars passed directly overhead at particular islands, they could maintain latitude during east-west voyages. Different star paths led to different islands, creating a network of celestial highways across the ocean. Wave patterns provided another critical reference. The ocean isn't uniform. Swells generated by distant weather systems travel thousands of miles, creating consistent patterns navigators could read. Where swells intersect, they create distinctive interference patterns. Islands disrupt these patterns, creating refracted swells and eddies detectable from considerable distances. Experienced navigators lying in the hull of a canoe could feel these patterns through the boat's motion, effectively reading ocean topography through subtle vibrations. birds offered information about land proximity. Different species had different ranges from shore. Frigate birds, which don't land on water, return to land each night, so seeing them in the afternoon indicates land is within a day's sail in the direction they're flying. Noddies and terns have shorter ranges. Observing which species are present and their behaviour helped navigators estimate distance to the nearest island. This ornithological knowledge accumulated over generations, passed from master navigators to apprentices. Cloud formations told their own story. Islands create updrafts that produce distinctive clouds, often visible from beyond the horizon. The colour and shape of clouds reflect what's beneath them, lagoons creating different reflections than forested peaks. At night, the reflection of lagoons in clouds overhead could be detected, a phenomenon called te lapa, useful for locating low atolls that might otherwise be invisible until dangerously close. This knowledge was transmitted orally, not written. Navigation schools existed where senior navigators trained selected apprentices, teaching through practical experience, chants, and physical models. The Marshall Islanders created stick charts, frameworks of wood representing swell patterns around particular island groups, though these were teaching aids rather than navigation tools carried on voyages. Most knowledge remained in the heads of expert navigators, encoded in poems, chants, and practical demonstration. The technique nearly died. European contact and colonization disrupted traditional Pacific cultures. Christian missionaries often viewed traditional navigation as pagan practice. Motor vessels made traditional voyaging canoes seem obsolete. By the mid-20th century, only a handful of people still practiced traditional wayfinding. The knowledge was slipping away, remembered by fewer and fewer elders in increasingly isolated communities. Then in 1973, a revival began. The Polynesian Voyaging Society in Hawaii commissioned construction of Hokulea, a double-hulled voyaging canoe built to traditional specifications. The goal was to prove that ancient Polynesian voyages were intentional navigation rather than accidental drift, a theory some Western scholars had proposed. But there was a problem. No one in Hawaii still knew how to navigate traditionally. The knowledge had been lost. They found Maupiailug, a navigator from Satawal in Micronesia, one of the last places where traditional wayfinding still survived. Piailug agreed to navigate Hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti, a voyage of about 2,400 miles using only traditional methods. In 1976, Hokulea completed the journey successfully. Piailug had brought them directly to Tahiti without instruments, proving traditional navigation could accomplish what Western scholars had doubted. More importantly, Piailug trained a new generation of navigators, particularly Nainoa Thompson, who became Hokulea's first native Hawaiian navigator. Thompson studied with Piailug, learned the star compass and wave reading, and went on to train others. Hokulea has since sailed more than 150,000 miles, visiting islands across the Pacific and beyond, always using traditional navigation methods. The revival spread to other Pacific cultures, with new voyaging canoes built and traditional knowledge being actively taught. Modern science has validated these techniques. GPS tracking of Hokulea's voyages shows remarkable accuracy. Navigators routinely bring the canoe to within sight of target islands after days or weeks at sea. Studies of wave patterns, bird behavior, and atmospheric optics confirm that the information traditional navigators relied upon is real and observable. The methods work because they're based on systematic observation of natural phenomena. Yet mysteries remain. How did the original navigators develop such sophisticated techniques without writing? How many voyages failed before successful routes were established? How did they communicate this complex knowledge across vast distances between island groups? The answers lie partly in the remarkable human capacity for observation and pattern recognition, and partly in the accumulated wisdom of seafaring cultures that spent generations learning their environment. The achievement stands regardless of the questions. Polynesians explored and settled an area larger than any other human migration before the age of mechanized transport. They did it in wooden canoes with woven sails, using only what they could observe and remember. The Pacific is no longer empty ocean but a network of islands, connected by pathways navigated by reading nature itself. In 1987, a dive instructor, exploring waters off Yonaguni Island in Japan, discovered what looked like a submerged pyramid. Massive stone formations descend in steps to 25 meters below the surface, featuring right angles, flat terraces, and what appear to be carved roads and staircases. The question that's divided researchers for decades is simple. Did nature create this, or did humans? Kihachiro Aratake was diving in waters known for hammerhead sharks when he noticed the structures. The main formation measures roughly 50 meters long by 20 meters wide, dropping in distinct tiers like a stepped pyramid. The surfaces show flat platforms, sharp edges where planes meet at near-perfect right angles, and features that resemble architectural elements, steps, channels, what might be post holes. From certain angles it looks unmistakably artificial, like ruins of an ancient monument now claimed by the sea. The site's depth provides a timeline. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, were approximately 40 meters lower than today. If the Yonaguni Formation was above water then, it would have been exposed during the period when Japan's earliest known inhabitants, the Jomon people, were developing pottery and establishing settlements. This means that, if the structures are artificial, they'd predate the oldest known Japanese monuments by thousands of years, pushing Japanese monumental architecture back to a time we have no written or oral records about. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has studied the site extensively and argues for human modification. He points to specific features: a triangular depression that resembles a castle moat, twin pillars that look like constructed entrance markers, and tool marks he interprets as evidence of carving. Kimura suggests the formation might have been a natural rock outcrop that humans modified, creating terraces and steps for ceremonial purposes. In his view, it's not entirely artificial, but shows clear signs of human enhancement. Geologists skeptical of the artificial interpretation counter that sandstone, the formation's primary material, erodes in ways that naturally create geometric features. Sandstone forms in layers. When those layers fracture along natural planes, they can produce surfaces that appear cut. Wave action and tidal currents erode softer layers preferentially, creating what look like steps. Similar naturally occurring formations exist elsewhere, though admittedly few match Yonaguni's apparent regularity. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University who has examined the site, falls into the skeptical camp. He argues that the features Kimura identifies as artificial can all be explained by natural erosion of sedimentary rock. The right angles result from joint systems, natural fracture patterns in the rock. The steps form where horizontal bedding planes intersect vertical joints. The channels follow weaknesses in the stone. In Schoch's assessment, Yonaguni is a remarkable geological formation, but not a human construction. The debate hinges partly on what you'd expect humans to leave behind. If ancient people modified this rock, where are the tool marks? Underwater archaeology at other sites shows clear evidence of human working. Chisel marks, saw cuts, peck marks from hammering. At Yonaguni, such marks are either absent or ambiguous. Kimura claims to have found them, but other researchers examining the same features interpret them as natural erosion patterns. Context complicates interpretation. No pottery shards, tools, or other artifacts have been found at the site. No associated burials or offerings. Nothing that clearly indicates human presence. If this were a ceremonial platform or monument, you'd expect to find something, some trace of the culture that built it. The absence is striking, though proponents of the artificial theory argue that 10,000 years of submersion might have scattered or destroyed such evidence. Another challenge is the lack of comparable structures. If Jomon-era people were building stepped pyramids 10,000 years ago, where are the others? Jomon culture left plenty of archaeological evidence: pottery, figurines, shell mounds, pit houses, but no other monumental stone architecture from that period is known. The Yonaguni Formation would be a complete anomaly, suggesting capabilities and motivations we have no other evidence for. Yet the structure's visual impact is hard to dismiss. Walking down what appear to be stairways, standing on what seem to be platforms, observing right angles and parallel edges, the impression of artificiality is strong. Human pattern recognition evolved to detect intentional design, which means we might see architecture where none exists, but it also means we're good at recognizing when something has been shaped by intelligence. The tension between these possibilities is what keeps the debate alive. Some features are particularly puzzling. One section shows what appears to be a face carved into the rock, though this might be pareidolia, seeing faces in random patterns. Another area has two stone columns standing upright, evenly spaced, that proponents argue look too regular to be natural. Skeptics note that natural erosion can isolate pillars of more resistant rock. Without clearer evidence, both interpretations remain possible. The Yonaguni Monument, as it's come to be called, sits in waters that draw divers from around the world. They swim through the formations, photograph the angles and platforms, and leave with their own impressions. Some are convinced they've seen ruins. Others see an interesting rock formation. The structure itself is unchanged by these interpretations. Rock, shaped by forces we can only partly understand. Access to the site is limited by depth, currents, and visibility. Comprehensive archaeological survey would require extensive resources and favourable conditions. The few detailed studies conducted show researchers looking at the same features and reaching opposite conclusions. That's unusual in archaeology, where evidence typically leads experts toward consensus. At Yonaguni, the physical evidence appears genuinely ambiguous, and so the mystery persists. The stones are there, stepped and angled, worn by millennia of seawater. Whether they were shaped by human hands or by the patient work of waves and time remains contested. It's a puzzle where both answers, natural and artificial, require accepting something extraordinary. Either geology created remarkably architecture-like forms through purely random processes, or humans built monumental structures thousands of years before we thought they had the capability. And with that, we've travelled from crystal skulls whose origins are questioned to underwater formations whose very nature is debated. 20 mysteries, each with physical evidence we can touch, measure, and analyse, yet each lacking the context or documentation to explain definitively. That's what makes ancient history so compelling. Not just what we've found, but the countless possibilities still hidden in the ruins, the archives and the landscapes waiting to be explored. So which missing history fascinates you the most? Drop your theories in the comments, and I'll be replying to my favourite ones. Make sure to check out our channel for more videos exploring our lost past. And as always, until next time, stay curious.